Halloween night in a quiet rural city. It's the busiest night of the year. It's the kind of place where parents feel safe about their children and teens heading out trick-or-treating in groups without any supervision. After all, everyone knows everybody else, and they look out for each other. But for one young woman who was excited to celebrate her favorite holiday with her friends, this would be her last Halloween, and the ripple effects of what happened that night would haunt her family, friends, and her local community in ways they would never have expected. Today's case takes place in British Columbia, Canada, specifically in a town called Armstrong, which is around 285 miles northeast of Vancouver. It's quite a small town. The population at the time this case took place was only about 5,000 people. Armstrong is the type of town that appeals to people seeking a quieter lifestyle, surrounded by nature, while still being close enough to larger towns for convenience. It's also a great place to raise children, outside the hustle and bustle of a city, and it's a safer place. The town's rural character means spending a lot of time outdoors, exploring the fields, playing in the local parks, or taking part in the recreational opportunities in nearby towns like Vernon and Salmon Arm. Hiking, fishing, and day trips to lakes are common weekend activities for families in this area. School life revolved around just a few small schools where everyone knew each other, and relationships were very tight. There was actually only one high school in Armstrong. Plus, with limited entertainment options, teens living there in the 2000s often had to get creative, like hanging out at local drive-in theaters nearby or attending local sports events. Social life was very much about community involvement, whether it was volunteering at events, attending church gatherings, or just spending time at Armstrong's farmers markets and local fairs. Though Armstrong may have lacked the excitement of a large city, it provided a sense of security and connection. This lifestyle fostered independence with kids who walked or biked freely around the town. The small-town upbringing helped to create lasting friendships and a grounded sense of belonging. This is where our story begins, and also where it ends, in this small town. Back on June 11th of 1993, Raymond and Marie Van got double the blessings when Maria gave birth to fraternal twins. First came Kirsty Jane, and 2 minutes later, they welcomed Taylor Jade. They were 4 pounds 10 ounces and 4 pounds 13 ounces, and the Van Diest family went from 2 to 4 in an instant. Armstrong is where the Van Diest twins grew up. Taylor and Kirsty were very close, as you can imagine any twin sisters would be, joined by the type of bond that other siblings can't exactly understand. The girls shared a room for many years, and when they eventually got their own bedrooms, it felt strange to Kirsty. Even though they both had a new space and the freedom to be independent, most kids can't wait to have their own rooms, to decorate the way they want, and to hang out without their parents bothering them. But for the Van Diest twins, on what was supposed to be their very first night in their new bedrooms, it just didn't feel right for Kirsty not to know her sister was right next to her. So they decided to sleep in the same room together until they felt more comfortable having their own space. As kids, the girls loved getting outdoors and climbing trees near their home, enjoying the freedom to roam that the rural upbringing offered. The sisters both liked to do a lot of the same things, but they definitely had different personalities. Taylor was more outgoing and bubbly, while Kirsty was on the quieter side. Still, they were very close, and they were always there for one another. At some point during the girls' childhood, though, their mom and dad, Marie and Raymond, decided to split. Taylor and Kirsty remained living with their mother, but they still maintained a very close relationship with their father. During their elementary school years, Taylor loved all things related to Harry Potter, and she shared that love with her best friend at the time, Tish Cooper. There were times when they would pretend sticks were wands and use the spell Wingardium Leviosa so they could hide from Voldemort up in the trees or pretend to chase tornadoes. They spent so many recesses together, just being silly little kids. Taylor grew up into a curious, kind, fun-loving, and busy teenager. Her wit and her energetic, loving nature meant that she had a very solid group of friends around her. Good friends who became great friends. They'd do anything for Taylor because they knew that Taylor would do anything for them. Those closest to her affectionately referred to her as Tay, or Tay Tay. She and Kirsty attended Lenwood Middle School and then went on to Pleasant Valley Secondary School, the only high school in town, where Taylor quickly became close with like-minded students who shared her love for music and performance. Taylor loved music from a very young age, and she was very talented. Not only could she sing and loved to sing, but she could play the flute and play it well. She even had a really cool hot pink-colored flute. Taylor was involved in multiple musical pursuits. She was in both the junior and senior bands, as well as the school jazz band, and had a deep respect and affection for her music teacher, Jim Hoy. She was so sad when she found out that he was no longer going to be teaching at their high school, because music was such a big part of Taylor's life. It's where she made most of her closest connections, like with her friend Annalie Sheridan, who also played the flute and whom Taylor met back in the 7th grade when the two of them had to share a music stand at a concert. For the next few years, the two girls became flute buddies, playing side by side. It was also in the school band where Taylor met her best girlfriend, Zoe Unruh, and her best guy friend, Devin Ringland. Taylor and Zoe met in the 8th grade, and as the pair progressed through high school, they even took all the same classes so they could spend as much time together as possible. In 2008, the twins got the cutest little Pomeranian puppy. Oh my God, such a little cutie pie. And they named her Maddie. They took hundreds of pictures of her. There was Taylor holding Maddie after she gave the pup a bath, one of Maddie yawning, and so many more. Taylor and Kirsty both filled their Facebook profiles with tons of pictures of their fur baby. The twins also enjoyed feeding the ducks and pigeons at the local park, and would even go there with friends, bringing bread, tortillas, or any little crumbs they could gather for the birds. In 2009, Taylor, Zoe, Annalie, and Devon went on a school band trip, and they had an absolute blast making music together, goofing off, taking lots of photos, and making the best memories. I actually went down the rabbit hole on Taylor's Facebook, and I was thoroughly amused, reliving my own childhood vicariously through all of their fun pictures. I'm showing some of them on the screen if you're watching, but I'm sure you can imagine what a trip like this was like. The bus ride, the digital cameras back then, being away from your parents and in a hotel, just enjoying time with friends. As Taylor moved through high school, she decided she wanted a new musical challenge and switched to playing the baritone saxophone, naming her new instrument Boris. Apparently, she made it look easy, and she was actually pretty good at it too. Taylor was also involved in musical theater at school, which is how she met one of her closest guy friends, Clay Valstar. The pair even had a unique and creative nickname for one another. Clay called Taylor Taylosaurus, and in turn, she referred to him as Clayosaurus Raptor. Clay would text Taylor so much that, over time, his phone would autocorrect her name to Taylosaurus. After meeting Clay, he and Taylor, along with Zoe and Devon, were inseparable. The four of them were always doing stuff together and took so many pictures to prove it. 2009 was also the year that 16-year-old Taylor began dating her boyfriend, fellow student Colton Loring. They made a really gorgeous couple, Colton with his long dark hair and light blue eyes, and Taylor's brown hair and green eyes. In some of their pictures, they looked like models in a magazine. It looked like they also had a lot of fun together on their camping trips with friends, posing in front of gorgeous nature backdrops like waterfalls, hiking, getting some sun by the lake, or visiting the drive-in theater together, just enjoying each other's company. You might think that being so busy with all of her music commitments and being in love now, it would be easy for anyone's grades to slip, but not Taylor's. She was extremely intelligent, and the academic side of things came very easily to her. Taylor always made time for the people she cared about the most, and even though she had a very busy social life and school life, she was still close with her twin sister Kirsty, who often turned to Taylor for advice as a trusted confidant. When Taylor wasn't out with friends, she enjoyed time with her family at home. That was where Taylor loved to hang out, doing one of her absolute favorite things, watching horror movies. Yes, she loved horror movies and zombie TV shows like The Walking Dead, which premiered on Halloween in 2010. Halloween was Taylor's favorite holiday, She couldn't get enough of the spooky side of things and had plans to binge-watch all the Resident Evil movies with her good friend, Alexandra Bacon. Taylor was very creative and would plan out her costumes every Halloween. One year, she created a really gory look with makeup, making it appear as though she was unzipping her skin right underneath her eyes. She added blood, a zipper, and a strip of fake eyelashes cut in the middle. It looked really cool. Taylor and Kirsty had been dressing up together since they were little, enjoying Halloween as kids. Here's a picture of them. I think Kirsty's the vampire, and Taylor's on the right as some kind of animal, might be a bear. They would also carve pumpkins together, and Taylor made a really elaborate creation of Oogie Boogie from The Nightmare Before Christmas. Kirsty was also super talented, not only as an artist, she was really good at drawing and painting, but with makeup as well. Taylor loved to spend the rest of her spare time being creative, doing things like dyeing her hair and playing around with different hairstyles. RuPaul's Drag Race was another one of her go-to shows to watch with her friends. She also enjoyed playing mobile games as well as indulging in World of Warcraft. She was very good at it. She would even introduce her friends to the game and teach them how to play. For New Year's Eve 2011, Taylor and her friends had a pizza party, ringing in the new year together, but there was no way to know at that time that this would be Taylor's last year on Earth. It's hard to imagine that such a lively young woman would be gone in just a matter of months. If only time could have stood still, if somehow someone could have warned her of the evil that lay ahead. That year, Kirsty and Taylor turned 18 the day after their senior prom, on June 11th, and what a great birthday present that was. The evening of June 10th was nothing short of exciting. It was the end of a chapter. Taylor, Kirsty, and all their friends were graduating. The twins looked stunning at prom. They wore matching strapless gowns. Taylor's was a copper color and Kirsty's was teal. Both bodices were adorned with silver beaded lace motifs and a striking A-line gathered skirt. They both wore their hair up, with a couple of curled strands hanging down in front. Taylor completed the look with long earrings and a cream-colored purse. Marie helped Taylor fasten her dress in the back before heading out, and Taylor posed for a quick picture in their living room. It was a night everyone would remember, with so many beautiful memories made and pictures that would last a lifetime. Marie couldn't have been prouder of her girls as she stood between them for a photo. Then, 2.5 weeks after prom, on June 28th, 2011, Taylor and her friends graduated from Pleasant Valley High School. Being young, Taylor hadn't decided what path she wanted to take career-wise, but I'm sure, like many others her age, she thought there was plenty of time for that. She had worked really hard and was looking forward to just hanging out over the summer, taking a break, having a good time, and relaxing. Her next couple of goals were to get her driver's license that November, as well as her first tattoo, and Taylor had the design all planned out. It was fitting, given her love for music. She wanted to get the bass and treble clefs joined together in a heart shape on her inner right wrist. But first, Halloween. In the lead up to Halloween 2011, Taylor was watching a ton of horror movies, completing her last driving lesson, and of course, deciding what her costume would be that year. She turned to her friends on Facebook for advice, asking whether she should be a zombie or a woodland nymph. Ultimately, Taylor chose to go with the scarier option and picked the zombie. Her costume was simple. I mean, it should be. After all, zombies were just normal people until they were infected in some way and lost control of their brains, just walking aimlessly, hungry for their next meal. Taylor put on a pair of dark blue distressed jeans, a white tank top with fake blood stains all over it, and a loose-fitting purple shirt that slid off her shoulders. And of course, she put on the white face makeup with the dark circles under her eyes and more fake blood dripping down her chest, coming out of her nose, with a fake cut on her right cheek. That year, Zoe was dressing up like a dead body, which would coordinate very well with Taylor's outfit. Now, someone who was not from the United States or Canada commented on my very last Halloween episode, and they were confused about why anyone would celebrate a night of evil, as they put it. I thought I would give a little insight, very quickly, into what Halloween actually means to people who celebrate it. Its origin comes from a number of places, each with its own meaning, which you can research on your own. However, all of them tend to celebrate those who have lost their lives and are missed by their loved ones, not celebrating the evil that caused it. Costumes were actually originally worn to ward off the evil spirits that might come out that same night to do harm. But honestly, it's come such a long way since then. Taylor loved Halloween, and she was really excited to celebrate it. The low that night was going to be 34 degrees, so Taylor also put a jacket on top of her outfit since she would be walking for about 10 to 15 minutes to meet up with friends. Halloween was a very busy night in Armstrong. The sun began setting at 5:30 p.m., so of course, the kids usually got a head start on trick-or-treating a little before that. Plus, many people would gather at the Armstrong Fairgrounds for the annual Halloween fireworks and bonfire. The bonfire usually started around 7:15 p.m., with free hot dogs and hot chocolate at 7:30, followed by the fireworks at 7:45 p.m. The plan that evening was for Taylor to go trick-or-treating with Zoe, Clay, and her boyfriend Colton. It was the first year that Taylor and Kirsty wouldn't be trick-or-treating together. Kirsty kind of felt like the sisters were a little too old to do that anymore. I'm still doing it every year, but when you have kids, you start being a kid all over again. Taylor thought, you know what? I'm going to do it anyway. She had just turned 18, so even though she was technically an adult, she figured, why not go one more time? She was going to make the most of her last year dressing up, knocking on doors, and getting some free treats. Throughout the day, Taylor and Clay texted constantly, looking forward to hanging out that evening. They agreed that Taylor would walk to Clay's house, which wasn't far away, and everyone would get together from there and then go out. Before leaving the house, Taylor had her mom take some pictures to capture the attention to detail she had put into her costume. Around 5:30 p.m., Taylor said goodbye to her mom, who told her she loved her and to stay safe. Then she texted Clay, saying she was leaving soon and would see him sometime around 6 p.m. Taylor left her home near the intersection of Colony Avenue and the 2300 block of Pleasant Valley Road on foot around 5:50 p.m. to meet at Clay's, as arranged. This was something they did all the time. The area was very walkable, and on a night like this, with hundreds of other people in the streets trick-or-treating, Taylor would have been in good company. As she walked, she texted her friends back and forth, keeping in touch as she made her way to her destination. But 6 p.m. came and went, and Clay noticed that Taylor hadn't arrived yet, which he thought was odd. She should have been there by now, and if Taylor had been running behind, she would have texted him to let him know. Taylor's boyfriend, Colton, had already arrived at Clay's and was engrossed in a game of cards with Clay's brother. So Clay texted Taylor asking where she was, but he didn't get a response. Now, that was unusual because Taylor was glued to her phone and would usually respond within seconds or, at the most, maybe a couple of minutes. But as the minutes dragged on, Clay went outside to see if he could spot Taylor walking in the distance, but there was nothing. It was really unlike Taylor to stand anyone up and not make contact, so where was she? After about 10 minutes went by, Clay called Taylor's house, wondering if she had returned home for some reason. Her mom, Marie, answered but told Clay she hadn't seen or heard from her daughter since she left earlier that evening. As it so happened, Zoe was at the Vand home at that point. She got on the phone and explained to Clay that she thought the plan was for her to walk to Taylor's, meet up with her, and then they would both walk to his place together. But apparently, there had been a miscommunication because Taylor had already left the house before Zoe arrived. By this time, it was around 6:15 p.m. That's when Colton looked at his phone and realized he had received a text message from Taylor back at 6:01 p.m. But since he was playing cards, he hadn't noticed his phone go off, so Colton didn't see that text at the time. However, when he looked at it now and read what his girlfriend had texted, he became very concerned. All it said was, quote, being CRREPED'd, end quote. Despite the misspelled word, which was very unlike Taylor by the way, as she was an excellent speller and would make sure her texts were always correct and complete, Colton understood this as Taylor telling him she was being creeped. Colton knew that Taylor would use this expression to describe when someone was checking her out, like a guy giving her unwanted attention. But he didn't initially interpret it as anything alarming. However, since she hadn't shown up yet, he texted Taylor asking for more information, but she didn't respond. Now, with everyone worried, Clay and Colton decided to jump in the car and go look for Taylor, while Marie and Zoe decided to head out on foot and retrace her steps. Kirsty stayed back at home, just in case Taylor had turned back and headed home for some reason. Maybe her phone died, and she wanted to backtrack to the house to possibly get a ride over to Clay's instead. They weren't sure. Marie, Zoe, and Kirsty also reached out to friends and family, asking if they had seen or heard from Taylor, but no one had, so they just asked them to be on the lookout. They were looking everywhere for her, but as you can imagine, looking for someone in a costume among hundreds of other people in costumes was difficult. The streets were crowded with people walking, and it would have been hard to spot Taylor in the dark on an ordinary night, let alone on Halloween, adding an extra layer of difficulty. Then, all of a sudden, while Kirsty was at home, the house phone rang just before 7:30 p.m. About an hour and a half had gone by since Taylor stopped answering texts and calls. When Kirsty answered, she heard an unfamiliar voice on the other end. It was 14-year-old Liam Brown, a complete stranger. Liam didn't know who he was speaking with, but he told Kirsty he was calling from an LG cell phone that he and his friends had found as they were walking along the railroad tracks behind Armstrong Elementary School. Liam explained that he dialed the number listed as home in the phone's contact list, hoping to notify someone that he'd found their device. Kirsty's heart sank. Something wasn't right. Taylor had an LG phone, and the train tracks were in the direction where she could have been walking, although it wasn't typical for her to take a shortcut in that area. So why would her phone be over there? Where was Taylor? And how would she have lost her phone? She would never have left it there on purpose. She knew that if Taylor had noticed her phone was gone, it wouldn't have taken her long, since she always had it on her. Taylor would have either come back home or been at Clay's well before he called to say she hadn't shown up. Kirsty gave Liam their address so he could bring the cell phone over to her. Around this time, Clay and Colton also called the van home to say that Taylor still had not been located. Kirsty immediately called her mom, who was still searching with Zoe, and explained how this random 14-year-old boy was on his way over to deliver Taylor's cell phone. That was enough. Once Marie heard that, she didn't waste any time. She immediately called the Armstrong Detachment of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or the RCMP, to report Taylor missing and that her cell phone had been found. With time being of the essence, Marie and Zoe headed off to search the area of the railroad tracks where Taylor's cell phone had been located, and they called Colton and Clay, telling them to meet them there. Once together, the four of them walked around, calling out Taylor's name as they searched the area near the railroad tracks. But they didn't have much to go on. If someone had abducted her, she could be long gone and anywhere. They were looking for any clue that could help them figure out what had happened. By this time, darkness had already set in, making the search even more difficult. By now, RCMP Constable Milan Illich was on his way to lead the search. As he drove towards the spot where Taylor's cell phone had been found, he scanned the faces of all the trick-or-treaters out for the night, looking for someone matching Taylor's description, but he had no luck. When Constable Illich pulled up near the train tracks, Clay and Zoe asked him for a spare flashlight to help them search the bushes. Unfortunately, the officer only had one, which he had to use himself. He spoke with Marie to understand what had exactly happened. As the adults were talking, Colton, Clay, and Zoe walked further up the railroad tracks to continue searching. Additional officers were called to assist, and then the unthinkable happened. At around 8:45 p.m., just off the side of the railroad tracks near the 3100 block of Roselle Avenue, Colton saw something on the ground, concealed in some bushes in a ditch about 10 feet from the tracks. He saw what looked like someone lying face down on the ground, motionless, with the left side of their head resting on a steel pipe. Colton carefully turned the person onto their back and was immediately shocked by what he was looking at. Even in the dark, he could tell that it was Taylor. Colton began screaming Taylor's name over and over, and then screaming for the constable and Marie to run, which they did, and so did Zoe and Clay. I cannot start to imagine finding my loved one like this. When everyone had arrived to where Colton was and saw Taylor, it was really hard to figure out with the way she was lying in all of the fake blood. But once the constable was able to shine his flashlight in her direction, they got a better look, and it became clear that her injuries were severe. She'd sustained multiple cuts and bruises and was bleeding from her head. There was blood matting the hair on the back of her head. Constable Illich squeezed Tor's leg for a sign of life, but she didn't respond. However, she was still breathing. He called for paramedics, as he and Zoe placed their coats over Taylor to keep her warm while they waited for emergency services. She was fully clothed and was still wearing her jacket when she was found. She was just 8 blocks from home, around a 10-minute walk or less than half of a mile. While they waited for emergency services, Marie frantically held her daughter in her arms as the group attempted to help stabilize her, with Marie repeating over and over to tell her that she was going to make it, that everything was going to be okay. The ambulance arrived around 9 p.m., and the paramedics got to this chaotic scene, trying to make sense of the situation. However, as I said, Taylor's costume and her makeup, complete with splashes of blood, made it very difficult for them to immediately distinguish between staged injuries and real trauma. As they worked to quickly assess her condition, one thing became clear. Taylor had sustained a very serious head injury. The visible signs of trauma to her skull meant that she needed urgent medical intervention, leaving no room for delay. They got her immediately transported to Jubilee Hospital nearby in Vernon, where the gravity of the situation immediately became apparent. By the time Taylor arrived in the emergency room, she could no longer breathe on her own and had to be intubated. Meanwhile, Kirsty and the twins' father, Raymond, were notified, and they quickly came to be by Taylor's side, as did friends. They waited as emergency personnel were trying to help Taylor the best they could. Nobody knew exactly what happened to her. Emergency physician Michael Connanan had been told by paramedics that they found the young woman along the railroad tracks, without any more detail. The fact that she was near a railroad and had such severe injuries made the physician wonder whether Taylor had been drinking, or perhaps just wandered near the train tracks and passed out, and was struck by a passing train. The young woman had sustained a laceration under her right eye, a laceration and abrasions to her lower lip, bruising inside of her mouth, scratches and bruises around her shoulders, and wounds to both of her hands and forearms, including 2 broken fingers. Zoe, Colton, and Clay had arrived in the meantime, hoping for positive news. However, the doctors soon determined that Taylor's injuries were so severe that she required transport to Kelowna General Hospital, which was 45 miles away. Once there, Taylor remained in critical condition. In addition to sustaining severe head wounds from a blunt object, Taylor also had 2 red ligature marks around her neck. These appeared to be inflicted by something like a thin, long cord, which had been tightly wrapped around her neck. There were also some petechial hemorrhaging in one of Taylor's eyes, which was also consistent with strangulation. Now it was apparent that she had not been hit by a train. Taylor had been attacked. Nurse Diane Roar took Taylor's fingernail clippings to collect any possible DNA in the event that she managed to scratch her assailant when she had been found. There was no indication that anyone had tried to remove her jeans or her shirt because her belt and her zipper were both still closed and all of her clothes were still on. So they wondered what motivated someone to target her. Her friends and family, including the twins' uncle, Marie's brother, Paul, stayed by her bedside. By the next morning, on November 1st, KY had posted to Facebook with, "Come on, Taylor, you can make it through this. You just have to." But sadly, Taylor wasn't doing well. Her condition had not improved at all. The extent of her head injuries was so significant that she just couldn't fight anymore, and Taylor tragically passed away with her loved ones by her side that morning. Marie said the hardest part was having to tell Taylor's twin sister that she had died. The shock and distress from Marie, Kirsty, Raymond, Colton, and everyone else in Taylor's life was paralyzing and surreal. This just couldn't be happening. Just 24 hours earlier, Taylor was full of life. She was looking forward to a fun night out, and just like that, someone had taken her away in a violent and brutal attack. And why? More importantly, who? They were still out there. Someone else could be next. When word got around, and it did very quickly, to so many of Taylor's friends, they kept posting their thoughts and condolences on her Facebook profile, and many had the same theme. No one knew why anyone would want to do this to someone like Taylor. Kirsty said, "I don't understand how anyone could do this to her. She was like the nicest person. She had a smile that could light up the room. She always went out of her way to make everyone happy. No one disliked her. I don't understand how anyone could have done this. I just want her back." It was puzzling to everyone, even the authorities. With Taylor's death now a murder investigation, more than 30 officers were assigned to her case. For the city of Armstrong, this homicide was actually the fourth tragedy the community had experienced in such a very short time, over just a month, which was very odd. There had been an 18-year-old young man who was electrocuted at his work site. 2 children who were just 4 and 5 years old died in a motorhome fire, and an elderly couple, 83 years old, who had recently celebrated their 60th anniversary, died as a result of a car accident. What in the world was happening in this town? So many tragedies in such a short time. It was a lot to deal with, but this was a murder. Police helicopters and dog teams from the Southeast District Major Crime Section were part of the resources dedicated to finding Taylor's killer or killers. What they knew was that Taylor had been in an area she was very familiar with when she was attacked. She had no enemies or anyone in her life who wished her any harm. Despite it being a holiday, when people were everywhere outdoors, no one had seen anything. There were no suspects, and everyone in the community of Armstrong, including their mayor, Chris Piper, was terrified that a violent predator was on the loose, stalking innocent residents. Was it even someone from their town, or were they from somewhere else? They didn't understand how this could happen in such a strong community, where residents always felt safe. Back at the crime scene where Taylor was found, forensic officers were searching for any evidence to indicate what had happened in the area where Taylor had been laying. There was blood spatter on the ground, the surrounding rocks, as well as leaves nearby in the trees. Blood was also on a metal pipe, against which Taylor's head had been resting. There were no shoe prints at the scene, but that wasn't surprising because there was a lot of gravel and rocks in that area. Along the river tracks was a piece of rope, some tubing, and 27 yards from where Taylor was found, an empty 12-ounce vodka bottle. Unlike other trash in the vicinity, this bottle didn't appear to have been laying there very long. It was clean and new-looking. In speaking with Liam Brown, the teenager who found Taylor's cell phone, the officers learned that the boy had picked up her phone just yards from where Taylor was eventually found, but the boys hadn't investigated any further, so they did not stumble upon her body. The lack of leads at this very early stage did little to reassure this community. At a news conference, Constable Mendick made a public appeal for anyone who saw or communicated with Taylor the previous afternoon or evening to make contact with them. He also urged young people in the community to exercise caution when being out and about, to avoid walking or traveling alone in isolated areas, and to always carry a cell phone. Soon, over 50 tips came in to investigators, which was an encouraging start in the hopes of generating even more leads. They released the pictures Marie had taken of Taylor when she left the house, including one of the jackets she had been wearing that night, hoping someone might have remembered seeing her walking, or maybe saw her with someone before the crime occurred. Even though Taylor had just graduated from high school, many of the current students still knew her, and they were shocked, so they had counselors brought in to help people at the school process what had occurred. Law enforcement wanted to know who else could have spotted Taylor and potentially her killer or killers just before or around the time of her attack. They knew that other residents had been out and about walking to Armstrong's fairgrounds for the town's Halloween bonfire and fireworks, so they began questioning residents during their canvass to ask if they heard or saw anything out of the ordinary. Let me explain what this area was like and then what the residents heard or saw. The exact spot where Taylor was located was right beside the railroad, in the dense brush that ran parallel to the tracks on both sides. There were houses close by, with the backyards facing the tracks just yards away. And at that time, a brand new subdivision had just been built alongside the river tracks. There was also a preschool located right there as well. The rectangle at the bottom of the screen is the vicinity where Taylor's home is located. The circle in the middle is where her body was found, and the star on top is where the pumpkin festival and all the Halloween events were taking place that night. As you can see, there are a lot of homes all around this area and roads that would lead from where Taylor lived to where the festivities were going on. This meant that a lot of people from the area were walking all around town at the same time she was that night. However, what the investigators couldn't know for sure was which road Taylor would have taken from her home to where she was found. All three, Pleasant Valley Road, Colony Street, and Pheasant Ridge Drive, were the same exact amount of time, about a 10 to 11-minute walk. So it wouldn't have mattered which one she took. They all led right to Rosal Avenue, the road that intersected the train tracks. Essentially, she would have gotten to the same place, no matter which one of those roads. The hexagon that I'm showing on the map right now, to the right of where Taylor was found, is where her destination was. I'm going to blow this map up for you. The hexagon was in the vicinity of her friend's home, the circle was where she was found, and the rectangle is that new subdivision, just to give you perspective on this entire location. Investigators wondered whether Taylor had used these tracks as a shortcut to get to Douglas Avenue, or if she had frantically run off of Rosal Avenue and onto the tracks because someone was chasing her. The latter seems to be the most plausible, and I will tell you why in just a moment. A police roadblock was set up near where Taylor was found, and one was set up near her house. Officers were stopping vehicles to ask whether motorists had seen anything on the night in question. They had already ruled out 14-year-old Liam Brown, who had found Taylor's cell phone, and they were satisfied that he was not involved in her death. The next lead they had was from Armstrong resident Judy Klassen, who told officers she spent her early Halloween evening at home, handing out candy to children and teenagers. She left her house a little before 7 o'clock and walked to her daughter, Rachel's house, which was just a couple of blocks from where Taylor was found. Judy and Rachel, like many other residents, were meeting up and heading out to the annual Halloween bonfire and fireworks show. Judy told the officers she actually crossed the railway around 7:15 p.m., just a couple of hundred feet from where Taylor was later found. She stated that this area where Taylor had been was not a common shortcut used by pedestrians. It's unlit and unkempt, with dense brush. But apparently, this area that I'm marking with a red arrow, a few yards above from where Taylor was, is used by people taking a shortcut, but not the area that I put an X on where Taylor had been. However, we also know that Liam and his friends were walking in this area, so people did use these railroad tracks, even if it wasn't common, and that night may have been an exception. And I'll tell you why. These railroad tracks led right to where the fairgrounds were, so it would have been an easy way to just follow the tracks straight ahead all the way to the festivities. Judy said that on any other night, this crime would have been impossible not to have heard or seen. She said, "You would have heard a scream, you would have seen something." The timing creeped her out. She said the streets were full of people in masks and costumes, children and adults, adding this wasn't a quiet night in their small town like it usually was. Instead, it was the busiest night of the year in Armstrong. Judy and her daughter arrived at the bonfire at 7:30 p.m., and the fireworks started just before 8 o'clock. She recalled noticing that there were no police at the event, and there usually were, but now she realized they would have all been looking for Taylor. The next two women that were canvassed by law enforcement stated they did hear screams coming from the area where Taylor was found. The first woman, Delene Burlow, who lived across from Armstrong Elementary School, which is right next to the river tracks, about 500 feet from where Taylor was found, reported hearing 2 screams around 6 p.m. on Halloween evening. But initially, she hadn't thought much of it, given the holiday. Then, the next woman to come forward, the elementary school's custodian, Natasha Bello, told law enforcement that on her break from cleaning the school that evening, between about 5:58 p.m. and 6:20 p.m., she walked over to Delene's to get some candy and have a chat. The two of them were friends, and while she was hanging out at Delene's, they heard a high-pitched scream, which Natasha described as if someone had been scared. This really wasn't that much information, but it did line up with the now haunting text message that Taylor sent her boyfriend that she was being creeped out. That text went out around the same time that these two women had heard a scream, and it was misspelled, indicating that maybe Taylor was rushing to let Colton know that she was in danger or she didn't feel safe. But this is all they had to go on. On November 3rd, the police held a press conference to share an important update. There were no suspects yet in Taylor's case, and they urged anyone with relevant information to come forward, emphasizing that public assistance was critical to this investigation progressing. However, they wanted to make something very clear. Many details of this crime were being withheld intentionally to protect the integrity of this investigation. Now, this is a tactic known as hold back information. You've probably heard it before, and this is very important. By keeping specific details out of the public eye, investigators can actually filter out false tips and focus only on credible leads. If someone calls in and reveals information that they know hasn't been released to the public, they're going to give that more weight. At this point in time, only the detectives, the medical examiner, and the individual responsible for this crime knew exactly how Taylor had been killed. This press conference left Armstrong's community shaken. There were no answers, and the killer was still on the loose. So, of course, fear spread throughout this town. The lack of closure raised even more questions than answers, casting suspicion on everyone and anyone. They were just desperate for justice. The railroad signals at the crossing near the spot where Taylor was found soon became a makeshift memorial. They put floral tributes there for Taylor and her friends, as well as many other people from the community who hadn't even met her, turned to a dedicated Facebook page created by Chrissy and Zoe. They posted all of these messages of grief, anger, and even condolences about her murder. Marie, Kirsty, and Raymond were understandably overwhelmed with this new nightmare that they were now living, and so was Marie's brother, Paul Albert Bear, who took on the responsibility of being the family spokesperson. He told the media, "You never think of it, especially Halloween night. My God, there are people everywhere." He added that his niece's injuries were very, very horrific, and the person who did this needs to be held accountable. Taylor's autopsy was also conducted the very same day, on November 3rd. It was carried out by forensic pathologist Dr. John Stefanelli. The doctor found that the bruising to the deep muscles of Taylor's neck indicated that a ligature had been applied in such a way that the strangulation itself would have rendered her unconscious. However, it was clear that Taylor was still conscious when the ligature was applied because of the scratches to her neck. This indicated that she had fought back and tried to remove the ligature herself or remove a person's hands or fingers from her neck. Taylor was 5 feet 4 inches and 126 pounds, and she fought hard. She had defensive wounds on her hands, and the blows to Taylor's head had left 6 separate, irregular, 1.9-inch long lacerations to the same part of her scalp, and something called a comminuted skull fracture. I hope I'm saying that right. This is a complex fracture caused by serious trauma which shatters the skull into multiple fragments. These injuries were most likely caused by blows to her head that were delivered with such force from a long, heavy, hard object, and someone was repeatedly striking Taylor while standing over her. We know from the fact that there were 6 separate slashes to her head that she was hit at least 6 times, possibly more. Any of these would have been sufficient to render her unconscious. Even though she had received immediate medical attention following the attack, the cumulative effect of the trauma and the subsequent brain swelling meant it was unlikely that Taylor would have survived this attack, even if she had medical attention right away. The cause of death was ruled as diffuse bleeding in the brain caused by a series of blunt force injuries to the back of Taylor's head. There was no forensic evidence that Taylor had been sexually violated, and no evidence of any unknown hairs, fibers, or bodily fluids being present on her body. This was even more confusing. I mean, this was most definitely a homicide, of course, but what was the motive? If it wasn't her boyfriend, since his whereabouts were accounted for, investigators thought that it would be sexually motivated. But then, when they realized that all of her clothes were on and there were no signs of that, it was very confusing to them. Investigators were interviewing everyone and trying to piece together why anyone would want her dead. By November 4th, more than 40 officers were working this investigation, and time was running out. They knew they had a killer on the loose. The investigators were working hard and fast to get any information from people while it was still fresh in their minds, because we know eyewitnesses and ear witnesses, people who see and hear things, don't always remember them as time goes on. 2 days later, on November 6th, around 400 people wearing green ribbons gathered at Armstrong's Memorial Park to lay flowers at a candlelight vigil to honor Taylor, as well as those other children and young people who I told you about who had recently lost their lives. I wanted to give you just a little more detail on that. In late September, a former classmate of Taylor, 18-year-old Colin Rowan, was the one electrocuted at work. His death came just after 4- and 5-year-old siblings Ava May and Austin Klassen died in a motorhome fire. All the grief that comes with the deaths of people taken before their time had a heavy burden on this community. Those in attendance were shedding tears, praying, and even singing Amazing Grace. Then the next day, on November 7th, hundreds of people gathered at a public memorial service specifically for Taylor. There were so many people wanting to come together to share in their grief that the service was actually held at a local arena. Taylor's family requested that, in lieu of flowers, any donations should be made to the Pleasant Valley Secondary School music department. This was perfect as a tribute to Taylor, who loved music. In terms of the investigation, Taylor's cell record showed that on the night she was killed, in the time between leaving home and being found near the railroad tracks, she sent 10 text messages to her friends and to Colton, and received 7 in response. The very last message she sent was the one to Colton about being creeped. Then she composed another message a minute later, which just read Holly, but it was never sent. It was a draft. Now, it's not clear from the research who Taylor intended to send this to, but it appeared from the misspelling that she meant to type holy as the first word of the text. So I can imagine this would probably be holy, holy crap, holy moly. We don't know, but we could probably assume it was from being scared about someone coming after her before she either dropped her phone or it was knocked from her hands. Still, there's not much to glean from any of this. Then, a break in the case, something that didn't ordinarily happen in cases like this, but was extremely concerning. On November 9th, officers received a letter that provided a new lead, but a very disturbing one. Officers wouldn't disclose how they even received this letter or even whether it was typed or handwritten, but this anonymous person had claimed responsibility for committing Taylor's murder. But even more chilling was their threat that more women in town were going to be targeted and killed very soon. So of course, police held a news conference and urged the author of this letter to get in touch with them. The thing is, the authorities were not convinced that the person who wrote this letter was actually Taylor's killer. Why? Well, it contained very little detail about what happened to Taylor. Most of the information in the letter had already been released to the public, and it didn't include her cause of death, a murder weapon, or even a motive. But to be safe, investigators advised residents to be very careful when traveling around town and to keep in contact with someone. They even set up a dedicated tip line specifically for this investigation. Over 120 tips had now come in, but officers were not any closer to identifying a suspect. A behavioral analyst from Vancouver was brought in to attempt to build a profile of the likely killer. The question of whether Taylor knew her attacker or was randomly targeted was still up in the air. They did not know. But because of this, nobody wanted to go out. Everyone was on high alert. They were locking their doors when they usually didn't, and they weren't walking anywhere, especially alone. Parents were keeping their children inside, and it was sad because they always felt safe walking everywhere, but now they had to drive. There was a real loss of innocence in this town. There was no question about that. A lot of locals were having second thoughts about going ahead with holiday parties, with Remembrance Day and Christmas coming up as well. Everyone made sure that they were going to be inside after dark. Then, at the end of the month, on November 24th, a breakthrough was announced. Law enforcement had successfully extracted DNA from skin that was taken from underneath Taylor's fingernails. She scratched her killer, and they now had his DNA. This was huge, but the hope of identifying her killer was short-lived. What happened in this case was similar to the recent one of Rachel Morin. I don't know if you remember that one. It was the mother of 5 who was killed on a hiking trail. If you're not familiar with it, they found foreign DNA on her body as well, but the DNA wasn't in the offender database, but it was linked to another victim of a crime. The same was true here. I hope this isn't confusing. Basically, the DNA under Taylor's fingernails didn't match anyone in the criminal DNA database, but they found the same DNA profile in another unsolved case involving a young woman from back in 2005. Same DNA, both crime scenes. Again, the corporal made another news conference announcement explaining all this to the public. The killer's DNA was found, but its identity was still unknown. Here is what investigators knew about the other crime that this killer was involved in. He had sexually violated a 22-year-old woman back in 2005 in the nearby town of Kelowna. The following details were not released to the public at the time of this DNA breakthrough. However, I'm going to share them with you so I can give you some context from the law enforcement's perspective. In the 2005 attack, the offender was being given a tour of a business by the 22-year-old employee who was the only one on site at the time. When they got upstairs, the man suddenly pulled the woman to the ground by grabbing her ponytail. Then he forced her to perform a sex act on him while holding her at knife point, saying he wouldn't hurt her if she complied with all of his instructions. This violation continued, and the woman was made to lie face down on a massage table. The attacker subjected her to forced intercourse. The man then fled, but not before he bound the woman's hands with duct tape behind her back. She survived and immediately ran to someone next door who freed her from her bindings. This attack was so violent that it left the woman badly lacerated in her private areas, both of them, just so disgusting, so vile. While this attacker had fled, he left his DNA behind, which law enforcement had stored in their databank because they were hoping that one day he would be identified. Now the same man had been the one to kill Taylor. We know that because the same DNA is underneath her fingernails, and he's still walking the streets. Knowing how dangerous and violent this man was, the authorities wondered how long it would be until he claimed his next victim. Based on the new DNA information, the officers now believed that Taylor's attack was random and that she did not know her killer. In the Kelowna case, unlike Taylor's, the woman remembered what he looked like, of course, because she was still alive, and she was able to provide them enough information for a composite sketch. The perpetrator was a tan or darker complexion, Caucasian male, who would have been around the age of 19 or 20 years old, back in 2005. He was described as being between 5 feet 8 inches and 5 feet 10 inches with a solid build. He had short dark hair, dark eyes, olive skin, dark thick eyebrows, and also very distinctive dark sideburns that kind of went down the side in front of his face. Using information compiled from this behavioral profile they were doing, the corporal urged the public to cast their minds back to the days following Halloween. Did any young men in their lives change their behavior? Did they leave town, or did they have some unexplained scratches on their face, neck, or arms? Someone who might have looked like the composite. Maybe let them know, because the things that I just mentioned are triggers for attacks like this. If there were any men in the days leading up to Halloween who had lost their job, broken up with a partner, or experienced some financial difficulties, they could be a potential candidate for having attacked Taylor. This man would now be in the age range of maybe 25 to 26, Not a big range there, right? I don't know how people know that they're exactly 19 or 20 years old and then like 25 or 26. I would usually say like early 20s to 30s. But what I do know is that a lot of you could be real-life detectives. I have seen your skills of putting the pieces together in these cases. I've seen your comments. So your mind may have gone to what we know exists today, and that is familial DNA searches, like the one that led to catching the Golden State Killer or Brian Kohlberger, where they run the DNA and then match it to a relative of the potential suspect in hopes that they will know who it is. Well, this was back in 2010 for one, but it did exist. However, unlike places like the UK and certain US jurisdictions, where this is acceptable and even a legal practice, that is not the case in Canada and still is not today. It's because of privacy concerns. I'm personally all for it, but I do understand that many other people are not. However, if you are interested in putting your DNA into a database where law enforcement is allowed to use it to track killers, I'm going to leave that link for you below. In this case, familial DNA was not able to be used, and at the time, they had this anonymous letter, and they still did not have a killer identified, but they had this DNA and a killer on the loose. The community was trying to do its best to get back to somewhat of a normal lifestyle. Over 2,000 people turned out on December 24th for the city's annual downtown light up and tree lighting festival. But the residents were still on edge, you could tell. But they knew if they didn't show up, that would be a sign to the killer that they were going to back down. They wanted to show that they were unified even in the face of tragedy. That was really important to the people of Armstrong, especially in the lead up to the holiday season, a time when people like Marie and Kiri would be experiencing their first painful Christmas without Taylor. Marie said that there would always be an empty chair where Taylor should have sat. Weeks passed, and before residents knew it, it was well into the new year, 2012. But there had been no further information or developments announced in the hunt for Taylor's killer. Some people began to think that this case had turned cold and would remain that way. But what the general public didn't know was that behind the scenes, investigators had received tips in response to the release of that composite sketch back in December. Actually, residents from a nearby city, Cherryville, had called in saying that the man looked really similar to a local man named Matthew Forrester. The officers quickly learned that 26-year-old Matthew Stephen Forrester had been a former resident of Cherryville. However, he'd since left town, and no one knew where he'd gone. Well, that's interesting, isn't it? He looks like the killer. He's around the same age range, and he's nowhere to be found. People that knew him said he vanished off the face of the earth. However, Matthew's father, Stephen, still lived in Cherryville, and law enforcement wondered whether he was still in touch with his son. When the officers contacted Stephen to see if he'd heard from Matthew recently, he told them his son was working on an oil rig in Alberta and had been there over the Halloween holiday. At first, this sounded like a perfect alibi until 58-year-old Stephen refused to cooperate with the investigation. If you have nothing to hide, why act like you do? But it wasn't much of a surprise when they discovered that Stephen himself had been in trouble with the law since 1969. He had an extensive criminal record that included convictions for a range of offenses like drugs, escaping custody, auto theft, and possessing a restricted weapon. So maybe he didn't want to get involved because, he'd already had his own run-ins over the years. But that wasn't the case. Stephen had previously been employed as a truck driver, but just after Taylor's murder, he quit his job. In November 2011, he quickly collected all of his son's furniture and belongings from where he was living in Cherryville, and where he took those items, nobody knew. So investigators wondered if Stephen could be lying about his son's whereabouts, not just now, but back on Halloween night. Unfortunately, when Matthew left town, he did not give his former landlord a forwarding address. Then, when investigators pulled Matthew and Stephen's individual bank records, they could see that Stephen was regularly sending money to his son, despite there not being an obvious reason for him to do that. I can think of an obvious one, but I understand they're just trying to piece it together. According to the research I found, Investigators had also obtained a sample of Matthew's DNA. It wasn't exactly clear how they did this, but it seems that they tested some of his belongings that were left behind in his Cherryville apartment, which Stephen had not collected, meaning they were trash and available for swabbing without a warrant. Guess what? When they ran this DNA against a sample from underneath Taylor's fingernails, as well as the DNA from the crime that occurred in 2005, it was a match for Matthew Forrester. Now they had probable cause for a warrant to pull his phone records. Matthew's cell phone records indicated he had been in Armstrong on October 31st in the hours leading up to Taylor's murder. So let me give you the details. At around 3 p.m., Matthew left the town of Lumbee, 30 miles from Armstrong. At 3:19 p.m., his cell phone pinged off of a tower in Vernon. I'm going to show this on a map. Then it pinged off a tower in Armstrong between 3:45 and 4:46 p.m. Then between 5:28 p.m. and 5:43 p.m., Matthew's cell phone pinged off a tower in the nearby city of Enderby, just 8.5 miles north of Armstrong. There was no further activity on his cell phone until 8:35 p.m. that night, when the records indicate that Matthew was back in Lumbee. It's like he came into this town just to kill Taylor. Matthew's dad, Stephen, had lied when he provided his son with an alibi, so law enforcement obtained a warrant to tap his phone, not only to see what else he may have lied about, but also to see if he could lead them to Matthew. It wasn't long before incriminating phone calls between father and son were made via a prepaid cell phone. It didn't just reveal that Matthew may have been Taylor's killer, but that Stephen had probably helped his son evade the police. What are parents willing to do for their children, even if they're evil? Well, sometimes anything, especially here, where it doesn't seem like the apple fell too far from the tree and was even more rotten. But now, with law enforcement sniffing around and asking questions, Stephen was getting worried. He told Matthew to dispose of his ID, which was fake, by the way, and also to change his social security numbers on all his job applications, while Stephen worked to get him another fake ID. What are daddies for? Then he warned Matthew not to contact him on the landline anymore because Stephen suspected, and he was correct, that his phone lines were being tapped and recorded. Between late March and April, Stephen told his son that his phone line was, in his words, hotter than a firecracker. In conversations between the two of them around the same time, investigators finally learned that Matthew was now living in the province of Ontario, in a town called Collingwood. While using his fake identity, Matthew, using the name Lee Sawcross, had actually secured a job in a glazing factory and was looking for permanent accommodations to live there. Matthew's dad had originally paid one of his friend's sons $500 for a fake ID and to be able to use their social security number, and that allowed Matthew to go on the run and get a new job with a new name without anyone asking any questions. And it was also no accident that the man whose picture they used and was on the ID looked just like Matthew, so nobody suspected anything. But on April 4th, 2012, Matthew was finally arrested at a motel in Collingwood, and he was charged with the second-degree murder of Taylor, as well as one count of sexual violation and unlawful confinement for the 2005 case. But guess what? While they were doing all this research, they found out that Matthew actually committed another crime before 2005. So he was charged with possession of a breaking instrument, breaking and entering to commit an indictable offense, assault with a weapon, committing a crime with a masked face, causing bodily harm, and confinement in connection with a third crime, an attack on a 19-year-old girl named Kaylee Paul. This was in October of 2004. It was a home invasion in Cherryville at 8:30 in the morning. On the day in question, Kaylee was woken up by someone who struck her head against her bedroom wall while causing it to bleed. The masked man, who had a gun tucked in his pants, ordered Kaylee to go with him, and strangely, he called her by her name even though he was wearing a disguise. Kaylee suspected the man sounded like her younger brother's friend, 18-year-old Matthew Forrester. She asked him, "Are you going to shoot me?" That's when the man told Kaylee what he was going to do with her instead, and she screamed that she was going to pass out. When she did, this scared him so bad that he ran from the residence, and no charges were ever brought against him because Kaylee couldn't identify Matthew 100% as the person who had broken in. But now it all made sense. This is his MO. This is what he likes to do: attack women and have his way with them. Back then, when this happened, Stephen and Matthew were brought into the police station, and Matthew was interviewed. His dad provided him with an alibi, just like he was trying to do in Taylor's case. It appeared that the case would have remained unsolved until now, following Matthew's arrest and Taylor's murder. He was held in custody and chose not to seek bail. The same afternoon, Matthew's father, 58-year-old Stephen Roy Forrester, was also arrested at home in Cherryville and charged with obstruction of justice and being an accessory after the fact. News that someone had been arrested for Taylor's murder came as a partial relief to Maria and Kirsty, as well as the rest of her family and her boyfriend and friends. Finally, at least one person would be held accountable for what happened to their beautiful daughter, sister, and friend. Marie thanked the team of investigators for their hard work, but she was also having a lot of mixed emotions. Now she knew what evil looked like, but there was still a long way to go in terms of healing and also to get justice for her daughter. At this point, Inspector Brendan Fitzpatrick announced the arrest at a news conference, saying that Taylor did not know her accused killer or his father. He also made it clear that the public's help was essential in what was still a very ongoing investigation. Police were still investigating the anonymous letter they received back in November, and they still needed help nailing down a detailed timeline of Matthew's movements leading up to the murder and on the night in question, as well as from December 2011 to late March of 2012, because that was when he was on the run. Now this is where it all starts coming together. Photos of Matthew were released at a news conference to assist the public in comparing him to the sketch from 2005. The pictures were pretty accurate. Matthew hadn't changed that much. I mean, his hair was a little different, but his face was still very much the same. However, the news of the arrest came as a shock to some of the people living in Collingwood, where Matthew was making his new home. He'd been getting close with a woman in town. He frequented a local bar where he met 22-year-old bartender Elizabeth Arand. Like many bar staff who are good at their jobs, Elizabeth would let her patrons talk to her as she poured them drinks all night, but she didn't ask Matthew too many questions. He didn't say where he was from, and he only introduced himself to her as Matt. But she knew that other people in town were calling him Zach. The two of them became pretty friendly, with Matthew even inviting Elizabeth to go on a hike with him. Now this outing didn't actually happen, and when Elizabeth learned of the arrest, she was deeply shocked. At the same time, she was very thankful that she hadn't been able to make that hiking date, because who knows what could have happened to her. Meanwhile, Matt's father, Stephen, refused to cooperate with the investigators, invoking his right to remain silent. He wasn't going to give up his son despite the overwhelming evidence in front of him. At this point, Matthew was doing a police interview with Sergeant Mark Davidson and Constable Bell. He was unresponsive, he didn't volunteer information, and when he did provide anything meaningful at all, it was only to agree or disagree when something was asked directly of him. Sergeant Davidson and Constable Bell were initially careful about what information they revealed to Matthew. The officers focused on making him feel at ease, building rapport, and even trying to pretend they were empathizing with him, telling him they knew it can be so difficult to tell the truth. But it was better to just come clean, especially if he had anything he wanted to get off his chest. Sergeant Davidson was trying to appeal to Matthew from the perspective of the Forrester family, his family, and how they wanted him to be brave enough to admit to whatever he had done, and that they loved him and would forgive him. Now, even though this was a tactic to get him to confess, it was actually true. Police had gotten in touch with Matthew's sister and his half-brother, and they were using them to try to get Matthew to confess. In a taped voice message played to Matthew during one of his interviews, his sister was begging him to just be honest and do the right thing. She told him in this voice message that she knew he was really scared and freaking out, but he needed to admit what he had done to both his family and himself. Toward the end of this interview, Matthew's half-brother was actually allowed to be brought into the room to speak with him. Sergeant Davidson and Constable Bell hoped that this would make him more forthcoming about providing a confession. After speaking with his half-brother, whom he hugged very tightly, Matthew opened up even more to Sergeant Davidson, but it was only in response to questions that were directly asked. Now Matthew knew the evidence against him was very strong. The police had his DNA, his cell phone records, and they could place him in Armstrong on Halloween. They also had those recorded conversations on the wiretap, and of course the evidence that he'd fled to Ontario. Afterward, he fled the scene, but not before he dragged Taylor, unconscious and bleeding, into the bushes to hide her from view. Matthew spoke quietly with his head down, as he said he only wanted to tell her to keep quiet. He didn't mean for things to happen the way that they did, and he even said that he was a good person who, in his words, had made mistakes. Well, his mistakes start with intent, so no, they're not mistakes. The only mistake he made was being identifiable from not being careful enough, and I'm glad he wasn't. Matthew agreed with Sergeant Davidson that they approached Taylor with the intent of intercourse with her, but in his words, it just got out of hand. While Matthew was telling him all this, the sergeant told him that he really needed to face his demons. Matthew finally replied that he felt bad for killing Taylor and wanted to apologize to her family if he could. Matthew didn't give any details about what he did with the murder weapon, only telling the sergeant that he later disposed of the flashlight, the shoelace, and his black coat in a dumpster in the city of Vernon, 50 miles south of Armstrong. Matthew told Sergeant Davidson that on the night he attacked Taylor, he'd been drinking alcohol and smoking marijuana, but he didn't say how much, how it affected him, or whether either of those substances were factors in this attack. This was an interesting point, given the empty vodka bottle that had been found at the scene, but there was nothing to suggest that the bottle had come from Matthew. And if you're wondering whether any testing was done on this bottle, just hold on to that thought because I'm going to come back to it later. A week after Matthew and his father Stephen were arrested, investigators released video footage of the men being taken into custody, as well as additional photographs, in an attempt to get even more information from the public. In the meantime, Matthew's truck had been seized for forensic testing. He had actually sold his truck right after Taylor's murder, and the police were able to track down the new owner. Just before Matthew's arrest on April 11th, Corporal Cook, who had been the one that analyzed the crime scene where Taylor was found, also discovered blood behind the passenger seat of Matthew's truck, which was consistent with Taylor's DNA. The driver's seat cover was also sent for testing. Based on this evidence, on April 19th, the charge against Matthew in connection with Taylor's death was actually upgraded to first-degree murder. 5 months later, on October 11th, Matthew waived his right to a preliminary hearing, and his motion for a change of venue was actually denied, and so was his request for bail, much to the relief of Kirsty and Marie. They did not want this guy out on the streets again, and they also wanted him to face their community. He wanted to get a change of venue because, everyone in this town knew what happened. But the mother and daughter were also facing another painful milestone in the form of the first anniversary of Taylor's murder. On the evening of October 31st, 2012, a candlelight walk was held in Taylor's honor, organized by their neighbor, Dorianne Cole, who's actually a pretty famous actress. This walk went up Pleasant Valley Road where they lived, onto Rosal Avenue where Taylor was found, and moved through the streets of Armstrong. The mayor had asked the residents to keep their front porch lights on throughout the night. This was the first of what was named the annual Spirit Walk in Taylor's memory. In the 12 months following her murder, the Armstrong residents had rallied around Marie and Kirsty, and they continued to provide as much emotional, financial, and practical support as they could. Marie had found it difficult to even leave her house. Life had already been challenging for her as a single mother, but she was overwhelmed and so grateful for the compassion that her community was showing her at such a horrendous time. Friends, as well as complete strangers, brought flowers and food to the home, as well as holding fundraisers to help Marie and Kirsty, who found it difficult to talk about what happened to her sister. These were things that were so necessary, and I'm hoping that we can continue donating to causes like this. Because you watch videos like mine, we need to give back to these communities, so that in these times, there are funds and resources for them. The other thing on the minds of Taylor's loved ones was something that they had been working on within the community to honor her memory. They were working with Kelowna Pacific Railway in the city of Armstrong, and money was being raised for the construction of the Taylor-Vanis Memorial Trail, which is now a dedicated 550-foot-long pathway from Pleasant Valley Road to Rosal Avenue and to the west of the railroad. This was actually Taylor's twin sister Carrie's idea. The route provided a safe way for locals to take a shortcut that Taylor was walking on, or had been forced to walk on when she was attacked. Taylor's uncle Paul was actually the project's general contractor, and on June 23, 2013, Taylor's Memorial Trail was officially opened. Donations of money and materials from the community assisted the hundreds of hours invested by volunteers who had cleared all the gravel and the foliage to create this environment, with a paved, fenced-in path where walkers would feel safe. There were dedicated signs posted at both ends of the trail and solar lights along the path that kept it well lit, a carved wooden bench, and even a gazebo, as well as angels and other sculptures that create a peaceful and serene atmosphere in their small town where such evil had occurred. But let's go back to what happened when it was time for Taylor's killer's trial. Matthew was 28 years old when his trial got underway the following year, on March 24, 2014. Marie, Kirsty, her father Raymond, and Uncle Paul were all in attendance to see justice done. It had been a long time coming, and it was going to be difficult to relive what had consumed their lives for the past 2.5 years. But they knew they had to do it for Taylor and see it through. In Canada, both murder and manslaughter come under the umbrella term of what's called culpable homicide. For Matthew to be convicted of murder, the prosecution needed to prove that he intended to kill Taylor or to cause her such harm that he knew she would die. If they determined that Matthew had committed murder, then they had to determine whether it was first-degree murder or second-degree murder for the jury to decide. It was first degree, to which Matthew had already pleaded not guilty. They would need to be satisfied beyond a reasonable doubt that Matthew caused Taylor's death while committing or attempting to commit forced intercourse. However, on the second day of the trial, there was a slight turn of events. Of course, there was. Matthew had now formally admitted to inflicting the injuries that caused Taylor's death. He also admitted that her DNA had been found in his truck. The primary issues would now be whether Matthew intended to kill Taylor and whether he had been attempting to sexually violate her at the time. Apart from the DNA and the cell phone evidence placing Matthew at the scene at the time of the attack, much of the incriminating evidence against him had been provided by him to police in those interviews. The prosecution's case, led by Crown Counsel Lane Curry and Frank Caputo, was that Matthew left the town of Lumbee around 3 p.m. the afternoon of Halloween in his truck and headed for Armstrong. By around 6 p.m., he had wandered along the railroad tracks carrying a flashlight when he spotted Taylor walking all alone and followed the young woman. Matthew approached her and engaged her in conversation, hoping to bring her guard down so he could get close enough to subdue her and force himself on her. When Taylor rejected his advances, Matthew pushed her to the ground, eventually beating her with the flashlight and strangling her with a shoelace before fleeing the scene. And of course, they were arguing that Matthew wasn't seeking a consensual sexual encounter. Otherwise, he would have just gone to a bar or a restaurant instead of prowling the streets in a secluded area where he could isolate an unsuspecting victim. Matthew fled the scene, leaving Taylor alone and bleeding until she was found 2.5 hours later. On his way back to Lumbee, Matthew stopped in Vernon, where he dumped the flashlight, the shoelace, and his coat, which you have to assume were covered in blood. The prosecution presented 16 witnesses, including Constable Ilk, who gave an emotional testimony about finding Taylor at the scene. So did Dr. King Cannon and Nurse Diane Rumer, who treated Taylor at the Jubilee Hospital in Vernon. One of the paramedics who treated Taylor at the scene testified that the pipe that Taylor's head rested on was unrelated to her injuries, and that, in their words, it was what was called a red herring, meaning at first it appeared it could be related and cause her injuries, but in the end, they realized it had not. Dr. Stefanelli, who had conducted Taylor's autopsy, testified to the nature and severity of her injuries. This was the very first time that any of this extremely distressing and confronting evidence was even made public. The ligature that was used to strangle Taylor appeared to have been wrapped around her neck twice, or it had moved during the attack and caused 2 lines on her neck. Taylor's father, Raymond, hoped that his daughter had been unconscious when she was hit over the head as many times as she was, because he didn't want her to suffer any more than she already had. The prosecution then played 4.5 hours of Matthew's 7.5-hour interview to the court. It was difficult for Taylor's family to watch this footage. To them, Matthew wasn't shedding any tears in that interview. He was faking it, and he was only sorry that he was caught. I have to agree. In court, an issue was raised about what Taylor meant in her last text message that she had sent to her boyfriend. The jury had to have this explained in its full context. All of Taylor's friends knew what being creeped meant to them, but it wasn't a word that the jury would have necessarily understood. The prosecution argued that Taylor believed that the person following her had creepy intentions, someone that was there making her feel uncomfortable or unsafe. The Crown Counsel, Curry, also argued that the message was indicative of Matthew's state of mind. She argued that this message should be interpreted as Matthew stalking Taylor and that it scared her. Now, for the defense's argument, and I'm sure you all would love to hear what they are saying happened. I already explained that it was accepted as fact that Matthew had done this. He was responsible for Taylor's injuries, so that wasn't something that needed to be proven in court. The defense was led by lawyer Lisa Jean HPS, and she did not showcase any evidence, but she did claim the case was manslaughter or second-degree murder and not first-degree. She argued that there was no intent. There was no evidence her client had intended to sexually violate Taylor at all. I was stumped because hadn't the jury already heard his interviews admitting he was trying to do just that? Well, his defense attorney argued that if that had really been his intent, then why hadn't he followed through with it once Taylor was laying on the ground unconscious? Well, probably because he knew that he had just killed her. That's my take. Because there's definitely a line between forced intercourse and necrophilia. But the defense argued that Matt was only interested in talking to and possibly getting to know Taylor, maybe taking her on a date, and that's why he approached her. That's why he even came to that town, knowing that there was this Halloween event happening there. No, I do not believe that for a minute. He went there because he knew that there would be young girls trick-or-treating, and they might be alone. They argued that Matt was intoxicated after drinking from that vodka bottle that was found nearby. He approached Taylor, and when she screamed, he pushed her to the ground in a panic, causing her to strike her head on that pipe and inflicting her head injuries. How do they expect us to believe that when the pipe was stationary, she would have had to hit her head 6 times? The defense also talked about a bra and a shoe that were found at the scene, and they were entered into evidence. The bra was actually the one that Taylor was wearing, and they said that those ligatures on her neck, or the marks on her neck, were actually her bra straps that had somehow come up in the struggle. I mean, I would not have believed this, but okay. What was even harder was that when the pathologist was cross-examined, and you know how they have to ask them, like, could this be true? Could this have happened? Could it have occurred? He had to admit that yes, her bra straps could have caused the red marks. And he also had to admit that yes, one of her head injuries could have been caused by hitting the pipe, but not the rest of them. The defense was really trying to argue that Matthew hadn't strangled her, because that would look really bad, wouldn't it? They even argued that the shoelaces were too thick and couldn't have caused ligature marks. The defense concluded by claiming that if Taylor had received medical attention immediately following the attack, then she would have survived. But the delay contributed to her death. Matthew did not take the stand in his own defense, and that was probably a good idea. Before the jury retired to deliberate, Justice Rogers issued them a specific set of instructions to keep in mind. They were not to consider the fact that Matthew had been in Ontario when he was arrested, and the disposing of the weapons could be weighed along with the other evidence, but it had to be kept in mind that they didn't necessarily infer he was guilty. In just under 24 hours of deliberation, on April 5th, the jury found Matthew guilty of first-degree murder, and I think they got it right. He was automatically sentenced to life in prison without parole for 25 years. Taylor's family wept with joy when they heard the verdict. They were so happy, but would have been happier if Matthew had been sentenced to natural life in prison, which wasn't on the table. But they were overjoyed with the outcome. Matthew wouldn't be able to hurt anyone else, at least not for a very long time. But he was still young. If he did get paroled, he would only be in his early 50s when he got out. Taylor's father, Raymond, told reporters outside the courtroom that it was a wake-up call for small communities, which shouldn't become complacent in thinking that something this devastating couldn't happen in their town, because it can. This case had proved that these attacks could happen anywhere. It doesn't matter where you are. You hear people saying, well, that'll never happen here. And it happens anywhere and everywhere, even in a small little town like Armstrong, probably in a small little town like Enderby. Things like this happen anywhere. Taylor's mother and sister also spoke out, and I'm going to play that for you now. At least we got the best outcome we could have gotten under the circumstances. It will never bring her back, but at least now no other girl will meet the same fate that she met. Yeah, we're just happy that that animal is going to be off the streets for a very long time. Not long enough for me, but it'll suffice for that. But don't leave. There's more. It's not over yet. Remember that Matthew's father, Stephen, was also awaiting trial on charges in connection with Taylor's murder. Following Stephen's arrest back in April of 2012, an undercover officer had been planted in his jail cell. They wanted to see if he would confess to any evidence against his son. Stephen admitted he knew it was wrong for him to have helped his son go on the run, but he definitely wasn't going to take the fall for what his son did. He couldn't, because he had been in Alberta when Taylor was murdered. At the same time, Stephen did explain how he helped his son get that fake ID, not knowing that this whole time he was confessing to an undercover operative. Too bad for him. Just 2 days after his son was sentenced, 60-year-old Stephen pleaded guilty to being an accessory after the fact. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison, but did receive credit for time served. You might be wondering what happened with Matthew's other charges. For those other crimes, in his police interview about the 2004 home invasion, Matthew admitted to knowing the survivor Kaylee, but he claimed the weapon was only a BB gun. I'm thinking, how does that make it any different? But I guess if it's not a deadly weapon, then it doesn't raise the stakes. In relation to the 2005 attack at knife point, Matthew claimed he felt like he'd been taken over by something compelling him to hurt this employee. Really? Like what? An overwhelming desire to force himself on her? Because that's what I think. Matthew was due to face trial for both of these cases following his trial on Taylor's murder. However, he decided to plead guilty. On December 18, 2014, he was sentenced to 6 years for each case, and they were to be served concurrently with his 25-year sentence for Taylor's murder. He was also placed on the sex offender registry for life. He could not own a firearm and couldn't have any contact with either of the survivors. And of course, you probably could have expected this, but Matthew appealed his sentence, and unbelievably, I was shocked. On March 7th of 2017, the Court of Appeals in British Columbia overturned his conviction for Taylor's murder. Yep, I know. They granted this man a new trial to begin the following year. It angered me. It angered Taylor's family. It should make you mad as well, and I said it would. It probably will. But apparently, the court found that the judge in that case failed to instruct them properly. Remember when I told you that the prosecution was arguing that the text saying being creeped could mean that she was being stalked, and it went to his state of mind, like stalking her? Well, apparently the judge was supposed to tell them that they can't use the text as evidence of Matthew's state of mind, and he didn't do that. To me, it's like, oh, it's so technical, why do we have to have an entire trial? But that's fair, because, unfortunately, even if we hate it, killers have rights too. Of course, Taylor's family was absolutely heartbroken. Now they would have to go through another lengthy trial, not even knowing whether Matthew would justly be punished for what he'd done. Marie said that it was like a nightmare case of déjà vu. She was actually in support of the death penalty being used in Canada, and Taylor's uncle Paul felt the exact same way. The system failed their family, who felt that Matthew had more rights than the victim. I can understand why they felt that way for sure, but for me, I'm not as familiar with the Canadian justice system. But I gotta tell you, this case kind of gets worse. While everyone was waiting for Matthew's retrial on March 12th, 2018, there was a development. He pulled a fast one on everyone. 32-year-old Matthew took a plea deal. I didn't even know that that was possible in a retrial. He pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, but this was done with both the prosecution and the defense, so they knew about it. It eliminated Matthew having the chance for a further appeal, so I guess it's kind of a good thing. On June 5th, Matthew was resentenced, and today, the 39-year-old remains incarcerated in British Columbia. Even though Matthew was sentenced to serve 11 years before being eligible for parole, Canada has something called the Faint Hope Clause. I had never heard of it before, and this allows for people who are sentenced to life without parole for more than 15 years to apply early. Yikes. So this meant that Matthew could apply for parole as early as 2027, and he will only be 41 years old, potentially rejoining his father Stephen, who has since been released. This is a man who brutally murdered a teenager. Just think about that. Even when it came to the first responder on the scene, remember Constable Illich? Well, guess what? He sued. He sued the department he worked for harassment, intimidation, and abuse of authority. You might be wondering why. Well, remember that empty vodka bottle they found at the scene? They first thought it could potentially be connected to Taylor's murder, placing Matthew at the scene. Well, it wasn't. Initially, this bottle was taken from the scene, fingerprinted and swabbed for DNA, but it wasn't actually sent in for fingerprint testing and everything else until a week before Matt's trial began. In the end, neither Matthew's fingerprints nor DNA were found on it. Well, you would think that would be the end of it, but it wasn't. When the constable first came up to the scene, he took his jacket off, and so did Taylor's friend Zoe. When Zoe was being interviewed, she innocently gave every single detail and said that when the officer removed his jacket, a bottle fell from his pocket to the ground. Well, this became part of the official documents. When questioned about it, he said, "No, I did not remove a bottle of alcohol from my jacket. I actually removed a box of pens," and he threw them away before placing the jacket over Taylor. Unfortunately, no such box of pens was found at the scene when it was searched, but the liquor bottle was. This led to the constable's superior suspecting that he had been drinking on the job. They did an entire internal investigation, which they have to do, and he was actually suspended in August of 2014 for 11 months while this investigation was going on. They actually tested for the constable's DNA, but it wasn't on it. And he was already so distressed. He was already being diagnosed with PTSD following Taylor's murder because of the trauma he experienced seeing her in the state she was found in. Officers are human. Sometimes we think they're immune to being affected, but they're not. He went on sick leave before being medically discharged in 2019. The civil suit that he brought against his department was eventually finalized in February of 2023, so just not too long ago, and such a long time after her death. The court determined that Constable Illich had not been drinking the night of Taylor's murder, and that he had discarded a box of pens, which were later collected when his jacket was placed in an exhibit bag. So after all of that, the pens had been collected this entire time. His claim for damages was actually dismissed, so he did not collect on any kind of monetary settlement. But at least his reputation was still intact. but the damage was already done. But now, something positive. Today, the Taylor Van Memorial Trail is a peaceful place where those who walk the landscape path can tell just how much the talented, kind, and beautiful young woman was missed and loved. 100 people turned out for the last memorial walk held in 2016 with Taylor's family when they announced it would be the final one they would participate in. Her loved ones said it was taking a toll on them, and they would choose to remember her in private moving forward. But her twin sister, Kirsty, continues to decorate the trail on holidays as a personal way to honor her sister, who she now has to move through life without. Egypt Covington had everything. She was a popular singer in Michigan, had just landed her dream job, bought a new car, and was dating the man of her dreams. All of that was taken away one summer night when she was in her apartment alone, watching a movie. Egypt was in the right place at the wrong time, and all of her dreams were ripped away. I want to introduce you to a girl named Egypt. Jacqueline Elizabeth Egypt Covington was born on July 19, 1989 in Michigan, to her father, Charles Chuck Covington, and her mother, Tina Marie Turner Covington. Egypt had a very big blended family, with lots of step and half siblings. Her parents, Chuck and Tina, divorced when she was young, but she maintained a very close relationship with both of them, as well as with all of her sisters and brothers. Now I tried to keep track of each and every one of them, and from what I could gather, there were 3 other girls in the family: Jordan, Beth, and Jessica. Jessica was very close in age to Egypt. I found a picture, a really cute picture of both of them from Halloween as children, and they looked like twins. I also counted 3 brothers, Dejuan, Samuel, and Dwayne. Egypt was a name that Jacqueline chose. That is how her family and her friends knew her, so I will be calling her Egypt as well. Her dad, Chuck, remarried to a woman named Kristen when Egypt was around 12 years old. Egypt was very close to Kristen, who was also known as Chris. They were a very close family. They had a lot of fun together. They just seemed to be people who were accepting, loving, and supportive. One thing that Egypt's whole family and all of her friends were supportive of was her passion for singing. This woman was born to sing. Her voice gave me chills. Her voice would resonate through a room and touch each and every person there. She moved people with her singing, and she was going places. The people around Egypt didn't have a doubt. They knew that she was going to be famous one day. It was just who she was. She was absolutely gorgeous as well, and very unique. No one else had what Egypt did. There was just something so special about her. When I looked at pictures of her, I could feel it. Her smile, those soulful eyes, her face, it just told a story, and she didn't even need to speak. You could feel it through her photos. She had one of the biggest and brightest smiles, so genuine. And as I was going through everything, researching this case and trying to find out who Egypt was and what people said about her, time and time again, I would read the same thing, that she was the type of person you could not take your eyes off of. It wasn't just the way she looked. She didn't even need a microphone. She was one of those people that just commanded a room because she had a big personality, and that personality would fill the room before she would even get into it. When she made that presence, people would flock toward her. They wanted to be around her, just to get some of that energy for themselves, just to feel it. So it's probably no wonder she found herself in a job where she could use a personality like hers. She followed in her big brother Dwayne's footsteps and became a bartender alongside him. It was one of her first real jobs. Dwayne taught her the ropes. They would even have this little show that they put on together where they were side by side behind the bar. He taught her all of his tricks, and I'm talking, they would come out there, dim the lights, throw flaming bottles of liquor into the air, and it was fun. It attracted regulars to the bar, who would come to see them time and time again to see Dwayne and his sister, Egypt. But a lot of people say it was mostly for Egypt. She was the star of the show, not only at the bar, but also on stage. Egypt would frequently enter singing competitions, like the one she did in 2014 at Country Idol. This is a really popular competition in Eastern Michigan, and she was so confident on stage. It wasn't even about confidence in her ability to sing or being the best singer. It didn't matter. It didn't matter if she sounded good or if she didn't sing well that night, she was going to sing, and that's what mattered. She was going to own it. She was gaining a lot more recognition, which built her confidence. At this point, she decided she really wanted to put forth more effort into becoming a recording artist, so the next step was to audition for The Voice. She started to record some music with a producer named Mr. Peace, and he thought that she was amazing. He saw a lot of potential in her. He has a YouTube channel, and there are a couple of videos that feature Egypt. She just knew how to command an audience, to make them feel something, time and time again. Anytime I would read anything about what it was like to be there when she sang, people would explain that it made them feel something. You can tell just how passionate Egypt was about singing. She didn't just command an audience on the stage, she also did that at her bartending job. She had a lot of friends who were also in the industry. Her goal at that point in life, while bartending, wasn't just to be a bartender. She wanted to work her way up and land a job at a beer and wine distribution center. Meanwhile, she was working and living in a town called Belleville, just outside Detroit in eastern Michigan. I wanted to tell you a little about Belleville. According to BellevilleOnTheLake.com, they describe their community as nestled on the peninsula shores of beautiful Belleville Lake, a picturesque setting with tree-lined neighborhoods and a traditional downtown on the lake, enhanced by beautiful parks. It's a small town. The population was just under 4,000 people in 2010. Now there is something that's going to be important here, which I had to learn about. Belleville is part of a township. I didn't know what that was. The township is referred to as the Van Buren Township. And the way that I can explain this the best way that I can is that it's almost like its own government. So even though Belleville is in Michigan, it falls under the control of the Van Buren Township. More on that later, but I wanted to add I was going through Egypt's Facebook, and I learned so much about her. I went all the way back to 2009. She was someone who liked watching Weeds and Nip Tuck. She despised waking up early sometimes, and she thought her online classes in college sucked. It's like when we used to put up Facebook statuses, when it would just say, like, your name, and then you had to fill in the blank, like, Kimber is feeling blank. So she does also talk about loving yoga, going for a run, loving her little dog Ruby, who's a little pug chihuahua mix, and she even talks about losing a friend and going to their funeral. She loves to read tarot cards, and on this post on June 7th, 2010, which is actually my birthday, she said, "I just found my debit card that I've been missing for over a week. Just canceled it 2 days ago, and now I have to wait 4 days to get a new one." It sounds like me, and it maybe even sounds like you. I really think all of us can relate to someone like Egypt. In 2010, Egypt was working at an assisted living facility, sometimes even working the midnight shift. This just goes to show you the kind of person she was. She was compassionate and caring. She devoted her time to others, and she carried that with her throughout her entire life. She was also a big fish in a very small pond. She was very popular in her town. She was well known and sought after, definitely popular with the men. She wasn't shy about dating and had her fair share of relationships, and maybe even some more casual encounters as well. A typical young woman, living her best life. Everyone around town knew Egypt. Like I said, she lived in Belleville, Michigan. That's where she was born and raised, and it also became her final resting place. Now that you know a lot about Egypt and what kind of person she was, I want to tell you what life was like for Egypt in 2017 when she was living at 45576 Huron River Drive in Van Buren Township, Michigan. She really loved where she lived when she first moved in. It's a little house. I'm going to show it to you right here. Now it looks like it's just a house because it has this one door, but it's actually a duplex. When you go through that front door, there are 2 other doors on either side of a hall. One's on the left and the other is on the right. Each one of those doors goes to their own unit. Egypt's unit was on the left, and the unit on the right was occupied by a couple named Steve and Megan and their child. Megan's father owned the duplex. And even though Egypt really did like living here at first, there came a time when she didn't. There were definitely a couple of reasons, or maybe more, that she was planning to move out in July of 2017. One of the reasons that she told her mother was that there was a lot of traffic coming in out of Megan and Steve's unit. When I say traffic, I'm just going to be blunt. They sold drugs. Legally, though, according to what I read, marijuana. They were running a medical marijuana business from the duplex. That was just part of their lifestyle and the business they ran, as well as breeding dogs, bulldogs, so they had a bunch of little bulldog puppies for sale all the time. Living there just kind of ran its course, and Egypt was ready for something different. Not to mention the fact that she had recently gotten back with an ex-boyfriend of hers named Curtis Meadows. So there's something you should know about Egypt and Curtis. Well, they had dated about a decade before this, when Egypt was about 20 years old, and Curtis was 28. They met back in 2008, and they had an on-again, off-again relationship, back and forth and back and forth. When they met, she was working at a local bar, and he came in one night. It was around the corner from where he lived, and he saw her, and as cliché as it sounds, it was like love at first sight. All of her friends knew right away. She also had a major crush on Curtis. She was just absolutely smitten by him. So they dated for about 2.5 years, but then there was a problem. It was their schedules. Curtis had a young daughter at the time, and he had the 9-to-5 type schedule where he had time to come home and cook dinner and eat dinner at the table, whereas Egypt, being younger and a bartender, had a schedule that wasn't concrete. It fluctuated. Sometimes, she might get home early, but then many times she would get home after midnight. That's just bar life. You could be strolling in at 2, even 3 o'clock in the morning or later. It just didn't fit Curtis's lifestyle, and as hard as it was, they ended up breaking up. It was not a good breakup because Curtis really broke Egypt's heart. But it was also easy to say this relationship wasn't that great, even as much as Egypt really loved Curtis. She would tell her friends all the time that they would get into screaming matches, and she would show up at her friend's door at 2 o'clock in the morning, just crying her eyes out. I mean, I know I've been there. I think we've all been through something like this while growing up. Maybe you're going through it now. So it was probably best that they did part ways at the time. But this wasn't the last time they would get together, and it wouldn't be the last time that they broke up. They dated a few times between 2008 and 2017, but this time it was for real. Egypt was 27 and Curtis was about 35 years old. They were ready. Egypt could not be happier because everything was coming together for her. The year before, on February 29th, 2016, she finally landed her dream job. She became an account manager for Rave Associates, which is a beer and wine distribution company in Michigan. Craft beer is a big business in Michigan, and Egypt had a genuine love for craft beer. Now that she was in this new position at her job, she could visit all of her favorite local bars and restaurants and use her knowledge and her love to showcase all of the new and exciting products that Rave Associates had to offer for these establishments. She was also working on her music career. She just got a new car, she finally landed the guy that she was madly in love with, and they were planning on moving in together in early July. Why does it always seem like bad things happen when people think that they've finally got everything together in their life? Isn't that ironic? Just when she thought it couldn't get better, it got worse. Way worse. Unbelievably worse. Because the last time the love of her life would ever talk to her was the night of June 22nd, 2017, just a few weeks before Curtis and Egypt were going to move in together. He sent his last text at 10 o'clock p.m. Curtis said good night and that he loved her, and Egypt responded with nighty-night. Just a typical Thursday night. Egypt had spent the evening doing yoga with a few of her friends, and she decided to head home around 9 o'clock. She texted with Curtis and told him good night, and then she chatted with her friend Lindsay. Guess what they talked about? The big move with Curtis that would actually never happen. Like many couples, Curtis and Egypt kept in touch a lot through text. So the next morning, he did his usual check-in with a good morning text, just saying something like, "Good morning, my love." She didn't respond, which wasn't like her, because it usually only took about 10 to 15 minutes for her to get back to him. But of course, no one's going to be freaking out if someone doesn't return their text the first couple of times. They could be busy, they could be getting ready for work, they could be at work. And that's what Curtis figured as well. Then throughout the day, Curtis was checking in again and again, and she still wasn't responding. So at that point, he had to think of another reason why. In his mind, he thought, maybe she left her phone at home. Curtis was not big on social media. He actually didn't have social media, so he couldn't exactly go check on her because he didn't have Instagram or Facebook. He had to do what many of us did before modern technology: wait. So he planned on going by her apartment later. That still didn't stop him from continuing to text her and say, "Are you okay? Where are you? What's going on?" That type of thing. Now, at some point throughout the day, he did reach out to one of his friends, and he said, "Hey, can you check social media?" He wasn't sure whether it was Snapchat or an Instagram post, but his friend said that she hadn't posted since the night before. So I went through her Instagram. I'm pretty sure this is the post right here. It looks like it could have been from when she was taking the yoga class that evening. You can see this post is from June 22nd, 2017. Here's what the caption says. It's a quote. It says, "And so with the sunshine and the great bursts of leaves growing on the trees, just as things grow in fast movies, I had that familiar conviction that life was beginning over again with the summer." F. Scott Fitzgerald. This is a very eerie caption to leave as your very last post on Instagram, considering what you're about to hear happened to Egypt. That night was indeed summer, and depending upon what you believe in, maybe Egypt's life was beginning over. But as far as what we consider life here on Earth, that ended for Egypt that night. It's just that no one knew it yet. Once Curtis got off work, he was having a late-in-the-week Father's Day dinner with his daughter. When they wrapped up, he decided to drive over to Egypt's. He tried calling her again and there still was no answer. When he finally turned down her street, and I'm going to show it to you right here, and by the way, this was not a very populated area, he just had a bad feeling. He felt like there was something wrong. It just didn't feel right. When he saw her car, he thought it was very odd that she wouldn't be answering, but she was inside. So then he thought, maybe she's just been mad at me all day long. But something is wrong. Curtis parked his truck, got out, and made his way to the front door. When he arrived, he noticed something strange. The door was open, about 5 inches wide. Hesitating for a moment, he stepped through and made his way to Egypt's front door. As he pushed it open, the first thing he saw was Ruby, Egypt's beloved dog. But Ruby wasn't acting like her usual self. Normally, she was a bundle of excitement, bouncing up and down, eager for attention, licking anyone who came through the door. But today, Ruby's demeanor was different. Her tail was tucked between her legs, and she circled around Curtis's feet, almost as if she was trying to lead him somewhere. Her barking was urgent, not joyful. Curtis started calling Egypt's name. No answer. Ruby kept barking, trying to guide him deeper into the apartment. Curtis followed, growing more anxious by the second. When he reached the kitchen, he glanced toward the living room, and that's when he saw something that would haunt him forever. Egypt's feet were visible from behind a piece of furniture. As Curtis moved closer, his heart racing, he saw her lying on the floor. She was already gone. Egypt was curled in the fetal position, her hands bound behind her back, her face resting on its left side. Blood covered her head. Curtis stood frozen in shock, his mind struggling to process the horror in front of him. He ran out of the apartment, heart pounding, and sprinted back to his truck. With trembling hands, he dialed 911. When trying to keep it together to tell the police what's going on, and then switching back to this horrifying realization that his girlfriend is dead, he goes back and forth between that reality and trying to really keep it together so they can find out who did this. I feel for anyone who has to witness something like this, especially when it concerns someone that you love. Now, I mentioned that the Van Buren Township governed this area of Michigan, so I'm going to refer to them as the VBTPD, or Van Buren Township Police Department. They had officers rush to Egypt's house. Curtis didn't have to wait long. They were there in just a few minutes, after they got the right address, that is. because in the complete state of shock he was in, Curtis gave them the wrong street. He said Bemis, which is kinda like a street over. This was Huron Street. Once all that was cleared up, it did not take long for officers to get there. When they arrived on the scene, the first thing that they noticed, which they were also told by Curtis, was that the door was open. But it wasn't considered broken into technically. There was no forced entry into the duplex. They were taking what Curtis said into consideration as evidence, that the door had been left open by the perpetrator or someone else. But the fact was, nothing was broken and nothing seemed to even be stolen from what it looked like, so they didn't consider this a robbery. It was something else. What it was to Curtis was the end of his future with the woman he loved. Everything they planned was never going to happen. Egypt had one gunshot wound to her head right near her ear. Officers also noticed there was a couch cushion lying next to her, which had been put over her head before she was shot. There was a hole in it, presumably to muffle the sound of the gunshot. That's when Curtis mentioned the neighbors, Stephen and Megan, who lived in an adjoining unit in the duplex, but they were not home. The only witness to this crime seemed to have been little Ruby, the poor little dog, just helpless and waiting for someone to come find her mommy. One of the most unusual things about this crime scene was the way that Egypt was bound. I told you that her hands were behind her back, but it was what they were tied with that left everyone questioning who would do something like this. She was tied up with Christmas lights on a summer night in the middle of June. The next thing the police had to do was notify Egypt's family, her big family. Word traveled from one family member to the next until Egypt's father, Chuck Covington, got the news from Egypt's sister, Beth. It was unbelievable, devastating to get a message like that about your daughter. Beth was hysterically crying, and Chuck could hardly understand what she was saying, but he ended up being able to make out that she was saying Egypt had been killed. Now Chuck had to relay this message to the rest of his family. He had to make those phone calls, one after the other, to every single person he knew who loved Egypt. One of those people was Egypt's brother, Dwayne Turner. I mentioned Dwayne earlier. He was Egypt's older brother who taught her all about bartending. He was a decade older than she was, and they shared the same mother, Tina. About 45 minutes away across town, Dwayne was having a reunion with his three closest friends, Matt, Leah, and Aaron, at a place called Social Kitchen, a restaurant and bar in Birmingham, Michigan. They had not seen each other in years, and everything was so perfect that night. The weather was great, the crowd was really happening, and they were enjoying the food and the drinks, catching up. But it was just before midnight when Dwayne saw Egypt's father calling him. When he looked down and saw who it was, he was a bit confused. He wasn't used to getting calls from Chuck, but of course, he answered right away. At first, he couldn't even understand the words coming out of Chuck's mouth. He was just sobbing. Dwayne was trying to understand what he was saying over the music, the sound of the crowd, all the noise in the background. He was finally able to make out something like, "We lost Egypt. She was killed. She's gone." That's shocking. You're enjoying this night with your friends. Nothing like this is in your head. You never imagined you would get a call like that. Dwayne fell to his knees right there in front of everyone, shamelessly crying on the floor. But who wouldn't? This is his little sister. At least he was surrounded by people who loved and cared about him, who were there to console him. They got him up and let him out the back door. They stayed with him for the rest of the night, making sure he was okay and comforting him in the best way they knew how. Egypt was Dwayne's mini-me. He is the person she would come to for advice, especially on bartending. He wrote a poem about her. After reading it, the qualities about Egypt that I wanted to share were these. She was the black sheep of her family. She had a smile that would brighten the room. She loved to cook. She was a very generous person. She would give you the shirt right off her back. She was definitely the life of the party, and music was just part of her. It was her passion. Everybody loved Egypt. So who would have done this? That is what everyone was thinking when they heard the news. They were asking why. She had the kindest heart, she was just a good person, and justice had to be done. Then there was Tina. She also received a call from Egypt's father, her ex-husband, Chuck. I don't think she would have been expecting to hear from him because they were not exactly on the best terms, even after all of these years. As much as Egypt loved both her mother and her father so very much, they just did not see eye to eye. I can tell you, from what I know through all the research I've done, they are two very different people. I know opposites do attract, but not always, and not forever. These two definitely butted heads. But in that moment, there was solidarity. In that moment, they came together, because in that moment, Tina found out that her baby girl had been murdered. When she heard those words, all she could remember was screaming and crying and saying, "Not my baby." Tina couldn't imagine how this could happen. She just couldn't bear to think about the fact that she couldn't be there for her baby. As we get older, we are still our parents' babies. We're the adult children, but no matter how old my mom gets, she's still going to consider me her baby, and I'm going to consider my daughter my baby. Tina just felt like she couldn't protect Egypt. She just wanted to know why. Why her? It didn't take long for the news of Egypt's murder to spread across the peaceful lake town. They did not have homicides in this area very often, one, maybe two, if that, in a year. So residents were definitely not used to seeing a headline that said, "Woman found murdered in her home." Even though all these local news stations, newspapers, and everything were picking up this story, not much was actually being said. In good part because the authorities didn't want to leak too much to the media, especially because they had no leads. There were also some facts that Curtis did not want the public to know about, especially Egypt's family. And before you think it's something suspicious, this is more of a courtesy. It was the Christmas lights. He didn't want the family to find out that Egypt's hands were bound in a string of Christmas lights. He didn't want them to have that association every time they saw a beautiful Christmas tree. They would look at those lights and imagine Egypt's murder, so he tried to keep that close to his vest. But of course, that was a detail that was going to come out because, sadly, it's one of those details that makes a story more interesting, more flagrant, more clickable. I hate saying that, but it is true. It was one of those peculiar things in this case that many people have differing opinions on, and don't worry, I will definitely go into some of that. But right now, police are doing their best to canvass this area and to look around the entire permit for clues. The hardest part for local residents to understand is how could this happen inside of Egypt's own home? To them, it meant that this could happen to anyone. She was at the right place at the wrong time. Police wanted to know if the neighbors, Steve and Megan, had heard anything the night before, so they tried to get in contact with them. But it turns out they hadn't been home because they were at a music festival, a rave. It's one that they apparently attend every year called the Electric Forest Music Festival, and it was on the west side of Michigan. Because this is a small town, I guess a lot of people knew Steve and Megan as well. They seemed to be the town suppliers of marijuana because everyone seemed to know that they were going to be gone that weekend since they always went to this festival. I was thinking maybe it's because they were working the festival, providing marijuana for the attendees. I'd never heard of it before, but it's held in a place called Rothbury, Michigan. It's an annual festival that goes on for 4 days, one weekend, with multi-genre music that focuses on electronic music. There you have it. When I mapped it from Belleville, it was a 3-hour drive and over 200 miles away. Needless to say, the cops didn't think that Steve and Megan had anything to do with this crime, nor would they have heard anything because they were not in town. Egypt's family was sad to hear that no one was there. Of course, they wouldn't have wanted anyone else to be hurt, but maybe they would have heard something, maybe they would have seen something, or maybe they could have done something. But that just wasn't the case. The fact that none of the doors had actually been pried open and there were no signs of robbery started to lead police to believe that Egypt probably knew her killer. She most likely let them inside. And I know you're going to know exactly who they want to speak to first. The man that found her, Curtis Meadows, her boyfriend. He basically let police know right away that he was not guilty of anything except for loving Egypt. He had nothing to do with this crime, nothing. He said from the beginning, "Look at anything you want. You want to question me? Do it. I'll tell you anything you want to know. I'm an open book." And he was completely cooperative from the minute he made that 911 call. He told them every detail he possibly could know. He even sat down and did a lie detector test right away, and they grilled him for hours. There were a lot of questions. Curtis was honest. He even said, "I wasn't the greatest boyfriend back in the day, but now their relationship was stronger than it had ever been." So the Van Buren Township Police Department started to rule Curtis out. However, he gave them a piece of information about another boyfriend, an ex-boyfriend, not a current boyfriend, of course, but a recent ex-boyfriend, someone that Egypt had dated between the times that she and Curtis were not together. And according to Beth Covington, Egypt's sister, there was only one guy that Egypt dated when she wasn't with Curtis, and his name was Kenny Mahalik. Egypt had started dating him during one of her and Curtis's breakups. The thing is, Egypt's mother, Tina, knew Kenny's family really well. That's actually how Egypt ended up meeting Kenny. Kenny was 10 years older than Egypt, and he was really, really good looking. That's what people said. He was a really good looking mechanic, and he was a ladies' man. A lot of women were interested in him because of his looks. Maybe not so much his personality. I mean, he was charming and funny, and he definitely caught Egypt's eye when they were at a family get-together. But there were some red flags too. We'll get to that in a moment. She pointed him out, and she told her mom that she was going to date him someday. She looked over there and said, "Well, you're never going to get him to marry you, so don't even get it in your head." Egypt's response was sort of like, "Well, I'll fix that." So at one point, when she and Curtis weren't together, she decided to go for it. Egypt and Kenny started to date. To me, from all of the Instagram posts that I saw, they had a pretty whirlwind type of relationship. She was in love, as far as I could see. She just couldn't stop posting pictures of him, talking about how funny he was. She would always be hashtagging things like, "my man," and how cute he was, and it looked like they had a lot of fun together. The Van Buren Township Police Department was interviewing a lot of friends and family, and they were starting to hear Kenny's name come up multiple times. Sometimes just because of the timeline and people wanting to know as much information as possible. But many people who knew Egypt would say, "You know, you might want to look into Kenny." It might have looked like they had something solid on the outside, but that's not the whole story. They explained that when they were dating, it's not who she really wanted to be with. It was kind of like he was Mr. Right Now. And if that was true, why did they date for so long? They were together for 3 years, and many of her friends, like her friend Nori, who was very close to her, explained that she wanted to break up with him, but she also wanted someone to be around. She craved that companionship. However, she also talked about wanting to cut him off time and time again. But remember, she was close to Kenny's family, so she didn't want to do it in a way that would cause a lot of drama or attention. They were still friends, so she would even go to family gatherings, and they still called and texted back and forth until she got with Curtis. A lot of her friends did not have very nice things to say about Kenny. A lot of them said that their relationship was volatile, that Kenny would take her phone, go through all of her text messages, get all of her friends' numbers, and even go sleep with them to get revenge or to belittle her or just make her feel like crap. Those aren't actually true friends, girls, just so you know. These kinds of things made Egypt feel worthless. So Beth, Egypt's sister, said that when they were on this cruise vacation to the Caribbean that they took not too long ago, she confided in Beth about how bad her relationship with Kenny really was. Egypt told her that Kenny would punch holes in the wall and that they would have these screaming matches. They'd been at a wedding, and according to her, something bad happened. They got into a disagreement, and he ends up throwing her up against a wall. Well, this isn't looking good for Kenny, but they needed to confirm all this. So they go back to Curtis, and they ask him about Kenny, and he mentions that he knows all about that physical altercation at the hotel. Egypt told him that when the wedding had concluded, there were people getting together at a hotel nearby. The way that Egypt explained it wasn't exactly that they were getting physical, that they were physically fighting. It was more like he grabbed her and pushed her up against the wall to kind of hold her back. Curtis went on to explain that the police were actually called, but no charges were filed because neither one of them wanted to file charges against each other. The thing is, Egypt's mother, Tina, had a different story. She said that it wasn't just about Kenny. Kenny wasn't the only one that was loud and had a big personality. Egypt would meet him in kind, so it was both of them. They both acted badly towards one another, and she knew how to push Kenny's buttons. Tina said that Egypt just knew which buttons to push, and she would push them. Tina called it passion. She also said it wasn't a big deal. Kenny wasn't even a confrontational type guy. He didn't even yell, according to Tina. Not only that, Tina said that the incident at the hotel, well, when the police came, they made a report. And in that report, it stated that both Egypt and Kenny were completely intoxicated, and neither one of them was cooperative. So it wasn't one-sided, it takes two to tango. But was this the truth, or was Egypt hiding something from her mother because her mother was close to Kenny's family? Well, this is just the beginning of the Great Divide. That's what I'm going to call it, the divide between Tina and Chuck. I already told you that they were not on very good terms. They were already divorced, he was remarried, and now they're divided on something else. Right away, Chuck and his wife Kristen, as well as friends like Nori and Egypt's sister Beth, and the list goes on. They believe Kenny should be looked at as the prime suspect. More and more stories were starting to unfold about how they thought he was controlling and manipulative. The wedding incident wasn't just something small. The staff of the hotel were the ones that called the police because these two were arguing so loudly. So, despite what Tina may say about Kenny, he was aggressive and explosive, according to friends, and that he had a very short temper. Egypt's friend Nori wasn't going to stop. She gave detectives all kinds of information, text messages from Egypt about how her and Kenny's relationship was going, how controlling he was and possessive, and worst of all, he wasn't happy about the breakup. He was jealous. He found out that Egypt was back with Curtis, and it did not go over well. With more and more information coming out about Kenny, it gives more and more reasons to convince Chuck that Kenny's responsible for killing his daughter. His mind was made up. It made sense. Kenny wanted Egypt, and he couldn't have her. She left him for someone she thought was better, Curtis, and that drove Kenny crazy. It's like if he couldn't have her, then nobody else could. But any time things like this were said, Tina would follow it up and say, no, he's just a gentle giant. He's not like that. And she would continue to profess Kenny's innocence and be on his side. That was a problem. It's almost like you had to choose a side. There was no middle ground. As a matter of fact, when it came to Egypt's memorial, Kenny wouldn't even come inside. He was out in the parking lot with his nephews, but his mom was inside, sitting next to Tina. Tina looked over and she asked Kenny's mom where he was, and she said, well, you know, he's afraid to come in here. Tina stepped outside, went up to him and said, get your butt in here and sit down. Then she sat right next to Kenny. Can you believe that? I mean, you could hear a pin drop. It was so silent. It was like crickets. What in the world is going on? Was Tina sitting next to her daughter's killer? That's what people were thinking, and the plot will thicken. You're going to hear a lot more about this, but to make things even more uncomfortable, Chuck gets up there and makes a speech. Let's just say, after hearing it, there would be no question who he thought the killer was. Kenny. This solidified it even more. You were either on Chuck's side or you were on Tina's side, but the real question was, who's on Egypt's side? The Van Buren police were supposed to be, but they didn't seem to be making much progress with the case. They were still interviewing all of Egypt's friends and family members, which turned out to be quite a task for such a small task force. Though the community is small, look how many people came out to that one singing competition a couple of years before Egypt's murder. Hundreds. Not to mention the hundreds, maybe thousands of patrons that would come through the various bars that she worked at over the years. Almost a decade's worth of people who knew Egypt, or at least knew of her, and they all wanted to provide information. It's as though the interviews never ended. There was always a new person trying to provide a tip. And you'd think that these tips would be welcomed. After all, aren't the police trying to solve Egypt's murder? You'd think so, but it seemed like no matter how many people they talked to, the police were still laser-focused on Kenny. However, some new information had finally been brought to the table, and it wasn't about Kenny. There were a lot of men that wanted Egypt's attention, and one of those men was apparently her former boss. Now the stories varied. Some people said Egypt was in a relationship with him at some point. They didn't know if it was just a physical relationship or something more. But he was married, so many people were kind of hush-hush about it. Others tried to give police as much information as they could from what they had seen or heard during the time that this so-called relationship was materializing. What was said was that he took an interest in helping with her music career. So, right after she won the Country Idol contest, Egypt told her friend Leslie that her former boss at the time offered to take her all the way to Nashville for the next big tryout. Leslie didn't think this was a very good idea, but if you know Egypt by now, there's nothing that's going to stand in the way of Egypt's dream. So, she went on the trip anyway, but when she came back, she confided in Leslie that it didn't go well. Apparently, he wanted more. He wanted, more from this little deal, taking her all the way there to make her dream come true, that kind of what's in it for me thing, and she wasn't having it. So they got into a big argument, and police wanted to understand what this guy wanted from Egypt, what type of person he was, how bad was this argument, would there be any reason to harm Egypt, or could someone else have a reason like a wife? Dwayne was actually familiar with this former boss. He knew him, and he definitely saw red flags. He said the guy had a temper. It did not take much to set him off. He was known to flip out on people. The investigators called him in. Meanwhile, the town is buzzing about whether this guy could be Egypt's killer. Sure enough, rumors started to swirl around, lots of gossip about how he was infatuated or obsessed with Egypt. Maybe he wanted revenge. Just because she didn't give him a chance while they were out in Nashville, could that have set him off? There were a lot of questions, but it turns out the police crossed him off their list pretty fast. The reason? He fully cooperated with them. He said he was never interested in a romantic relationship with her. He was married and loved his wife. His wife knew all about the trip he took with Egypt to Nashville. He was just trying to be a good friend and help out where he could. He liked Egypt and wanted her to succeed, that's all. Well, the police may have ruled him out, but not the court of public opinion. They hadn't. They wouldn't rule anyone out unless there was complete concrete proof of who did it. Everyone was a suspect, and without more leads coming in at all, the Van Buren Township Police Department just kept going right back to Kenny. They still hadn't made an arrest, though, and he wasn't even officially a suspect. Not even an official person of interest. They just kept pressing Curtis and other people close to Egypt to tell them anything they could about Kenny, especially anything that seemed off. That's when Curtis came forward with even more damning information. He told them that a month prior to her murder, it was early on a Sunday morning while Egypt was spending the night at Curtis's house. He looked out of his window from the third floor and saw Kenny in the parking lot. Kenny's truck was parked behind Egypt's car, and Kenny was outside looking into her windows. What the hell? That's creepy, and the police thought so too. The police wanted to know what Curtis did next, and he said, "I just watched Kenny get back into his truck and drive off." Curtis did explain that Egypt told him she confronted Kenny about it, and he explained it away, saying, "Oh, I was just on my way to work and I spotted your car. It was starting to rain and I saw that you had your sunroof open, so I don't know. I was going to close it. I don't know. It sounds suspicious. Something doesn't add up." Not only that, there was a theory that Curtis came up with. He said he thought Kenny had put a tracking device on Egypt's car, and that morning Curtis thought Kenny was most likely coming by to retrieve it. Yes, because this wasn't the first time Kenny knew exactly where Egypt was. That's right. He had shown up at the same places she was at a number of times, and it started to make Egypt feel uncomfortable. She even told her stepmom, Chris, about it. She explained that she really wanted to tell Kenny that she needed to be left alone, she needed space, but it was hard for her to do that. She said Kenny was like a lost puppy dog, and Chris responded with, "Well, you can't save every last puppy." Everyone really wanted Egypt to move on, and they were truly hoping that when she got back with Curtis, this would make it clear to Kenny that she was done. But it just didn't seem like he was getting the hint until the Belleville Strawberry Festival. It's a pretty big deal in Belleville, something that the town has been known for since 1977. That's when it started. It was a way for local farmers to celebrate their strawberry crops, but it's evolved quite a bit since then. It's got it all: a carnival, live music, animals, bingo, a parade, Clydesdale horses, strawberry treats, craft vendors, a karaoke tent, and lots of great food. As a Southern girl, I like carnival food so much. I didn't see any corn, but look at this place. It happens every year on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday during Father's Day weekend. It really does seem like the perfect place for a little Father's Day fun with the kids. In 2017, it was on June 16th, 17th, and 18th. I get excited because this was something that got Egypt excited. I never want you to think I'm coming off insensitive and just happy while I'm explaining what happened in these cases. But this was a small town, and it was something that Egypt really looked forward to. It's a lot of fun. But even though it may have been a small town, it's actually estimated that every year the Belleville Strawberry Festival brought in over 200,000 people from southeastern Michigan and further. That was something important to note, considering Egypt was in attendance on Saturday, June 17th, just days before she was found dead. Kenny was there too, and so was Curtis. Curtis got there first and planned to meet up with Egypt. However, Egypt's plan was to meet with Kenny to let him know once and for all they were done, that she was serious about Curtis and they were moving in together. When Curtis arrived, he saw Kenny right away, so he made sure to stay away. According to him, he wasn't there to get involved. Once Egypt arrived, she went right over to Kenny, who was surrounded by a group of their friends. From what Curtis could see from afar, they were having a very intense conversation. He had no idea what kind of words were being exchanged, but from the body language alone, it said it all. Once Egypt was done, she started to walk toward Curtis, but Kenny didn't stay back. He was following her. So she turns around and gets in his face. Then they exchanged some heated words. They were very upset. She ends up running off, and then 5 days later, she's murdered. They had already interviewed Kenny from the beginning of this investigation. Just hours after Egypt's body was found, he was out at a bar. Then they found him, brought him back to the station, and kept him there for hours, grilling him with question after question. The most important one was, "Where were you on the night of June 22nd?" He said they spent most of his evening out at bars with his friends, and then he went home and went to bed. It's not a great alibi. You've got your drunk friends, and then you were home alone. That's not the only reason Kenny was their number one person of interest. He failed the polygraph test. Yeah, and it was bad. The only thing they said he got right was his name and the date. After that, everyone thought Kenny was guilty. But polygraphs? Really, they're not admissible in court. So unless they found real concrete evidence, nothing more could be done. But it was even harder to do anything to Kenny because he retained an attorney. He seemed to be sick of having all the fingers pointed in his direction, and he claimed he was innocent. He wanted them to go look at someone else because her killer was still on the loose, and it wasn't him. I hope you are still here watching this because it's about to get crazy. I've never even done a case like this. Just wait. I'm telling you, just wait. Caught in the middle of all this was D. Wayne. He was Tina's son too. It's hard not to take your mother's side. He loves his sister, and he just wants the truth to come out. He didn't even want to pick sides, but he knew that his mother had always been taught that you do not go around accusing someone of something that could ruin their life unless you have proof. So, what actual proof did the Van Buren Township Police Department have? Sooner or later, Tina was being pegged as someone who was a traitor or betraying her own daughter, especially when Chuck's side found out Tina allowed Kenny to babysit little Ruby, the dog. Here's something else I want to just say as a caveat. Tina was desperate. At one point, she even went to an expert to try to see if the dog could somehow remember something, recognize the killer somehow. I know it sounds silly, but guys, I don't know if you've ever been in this situation. I know I have not. You're at your wit's end. you're going to go through any possible way to get more information. It turns out that this expert said yes. A dog can react differently to seeing somebody that you know had done something like this, but the only thing they would probably do is just back away from them. So there's no real science behind it, and there's no real data to use for these purposes. But I just wanted to let you know, that's how desperate her family really was. As far as the whole situation with Ruby and Kenny, Tina thought it was absurd. Ruby knew Kenny, Ruby loved Kenny, and Kenny loved Ruby. Tina insisted that Egypt would always let Kenny babysit Ruby anytime he wanted, and Tina just couldn't say no. Kenny had lost Egypt. She didn't want him to lose Ruby too. No one was thinking about that. As far as Tina was concerned, regardless of the allegations, Tina saw things differently. Maybe she was biased because she was close to Kenny and his family. The real reason she didn't think differently after Kenny was officially named the person of interest, which was 9 months following the murder, was because she thought the Van Buren Township Police Department was just a small department that didn't have the resources to get it right. They had to pin the murder on someone, so why not the ex-boyfriend who had a public fight with her just days before her murder? Tina thought this was a job for a much bigger department, like the Michigan State Police. Egypt worked in an industry that exposed her to hundreds of people. Anyone could have been watching her. It doesn't have to be someone she knew, it could be anyone. And Tina thought they needed to expand their search. Tina knew Egypt did not feel safe where she was living. She was concerned that this was not anyone close to Egypt. D. Wayne was leaning more toward his mother's side. 7 months following Egypt's death, his mind had shifted towards something else, or I should say someone else. I'm not talking about another suspect. I'm talking about a new love interest. Because during all this sadness, D. Wayne met a woman named Lindsay. They were both playing sand volleyball with friends and ended up meeting each other. There's a reason why I'm telling you this. I'm not going on a tangent about D. Wayne and his love life. Hear me out. It was January 2018, and D. Wayne may have been happy that someone like Lindsay came into his life, but he wasn't going to share the truth about his life with her, the truth about Egypt. It was too much, too soon, so he stayed quiet. Besides, Lindsay lived 30 miles away in another town. She wasn't part of their close-knit community. She was a mom of 3 and a kindergarten teacher. She had enough to worry about, and her and D. Wayne were not even officially a couple. They were just casually going out, having a good time together. However, after hanging out for, a few weeks, Lindsay had questions. One question in particular. She wanted to know who the gorgeous girl was that D. Wayne had on his phone lock screen. It could have been jealousy. It could have been pure curiosity, but she was intrigued. She just wondered who that could be, and it wasn't until one night, after they had a few drinks, that Lindsay got up the nerve to ask. She was not ready for the answer. Not at all. She wasn't expecting to hear that D. Wayne had a younger sister who had been murdered and that they hadn't caught the killer. She wasn't even expecting him to say it was his sister. She thought, wow, that's interesting. Maybe even kind of weird. But then, when D. Wayne told her why his sister's picture was there and what had happened and that his little sister had been murdered, she was in complete shock. I do not know how I would react, but Lindsay had a lot of questions. Maybe some of you wouldn't think this, but one of Lindsay's first thoughts was, oh my God, what if D. Wayne had something to do with it? I mean, it is a logical question to have. You hear that someone's close to someone who was murdered and that it's unsolved. She was like, who knows? And she was not comfortable getting closer to D. Wayne or letting him meet her kids if there was any suspicion that he was involved. She knew nothing about this case, where it stood, and she wanted to learn more. There were so many questions going through her mind. Who did this? Why did they do it? How did the police not know? And then she asked D. Wayne, did you do it? Where were you on the night that this happened? When she asked him who he thought did it, he said that the most likely suspect was Kenny. But then she pressed him as to why he felt that way, and he couldn't explain why. He even admitted to Lindsay that he had never been interviewed. Wow. Almost a year later, and a person in Egypt's family has not been interviewed yet? The Van Buren Township Police Department kept telling their community members they were diligently doing their jobs. When Lindsay found out everything that happened, she couldn't sleep. Maybe it was that motherly love and instinct. She'd been thinking about the fact that this was the seemingly unsolved case about someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's loved one, and that kept her up all night. She just kept thinking, how can I help? How could they get to the bottom of this? She was determined. There was just this light inside of her that was burning for answers. She was thinking about the fact that she has a brother, she has 2 little boys, and how the community and the police were already suspecting Egypt's boyfriend. So in her mind, she thought, what would happen if this was someone in my family? If this was a man in my family, what if they were being accused of murder, but there was no way for them to prove it? How would I feel? What would I want? I really like how Lindsay looks at things. She looks at things from both sides. She could put herself in Kenny's family's shoes too. There's always many sides to a story. But one thing's for sure, Lindsay wouldn't stand around without asking questions and doing something to solve this case for the sake of everyone involved. Her boyfriend, her boyfriend's family, Egypt's family, and anyone who knew and loved her. So this was the moment that Lindsay became Egypt's warrior. That was the mindset she had. She wasn't going to stop until she found the answers. And at this point, she wasn't even in love with D. Wayne. She really liked him, but she just had this overwhelming feeling that this was something she had to do. She's not an investigator. This is not her job to solve crimes. But after talking to D. Wayne, it didn't seem like anyone was. The first thing she was thinking was that they should start with the most likely suspect, the one whom police believed did it, Kenny. She heard that the Van Buren Township Police Department just needed a little more evidence. That was all they needed, one more thing. And that was what was stopping them from making an arrest. Well, then how could they provide them with that one thing so that they could prove it? And more importantly, if it really wasn't Kenny that did this, how could they go about finding out who really did? Well, Lindsay and D. Wayne were breathing new life into Egypt's case. Lindsay was going 100 miles per hour. She gathered all the info that they already knew, and she started to conduct her own interviews. She was making phone calls and pretty much gathering their own evidence, just like detectives. With modern technology, guys, everyone and anyone can investigate crimes. There have been a number of cases solved in just the past few years because of social media and people coming together on places like Facebook to gather information. Lindsay was doing all of that. Facebook pages, hashtags, t-shirts, flyers, anything and everything that she could do to bring and keep awareness on Egypt's case. Then, around 9 months after her death, in March of 2018, the Van Buren Township Police Department finally officially announced their person of interest. No surprise, Kenny. Around the same time, Kenny's lawyer put out a public statement, and I want to read it to you. Van Buren Township Police noted in their recent press release that my client was not currently in communication with the department, which is a bit misleading. He, Kenny, fully cooperated with police. Kenny was interviewed with the Van Buren Township Police on multiple occasions. He provided a full timeline of his whereabouts during the days surrounding Miss Covington's death and has remained in town for the entire 10 months of this investigation. Since being retained to represent him in late June 2017, his attorney has reached out and spoken with the police on a dozen occasions, asking for updates and seeing if they needed anything else from them. Kenny continues to maintain his absolute innocence regarding anything to do with Miss Covington's death, just as he has from the very beginning. At this point, people were even donating large billboards to be placed around town to keep Egypt's case in the hearts and minds of the residents, hoping that someone with information would come forward. They needed a tip, a lead, something to go on, or something to put Kenny behind bars. Investigators even suggested that the donors place the billboards on Kenny's street, hoping this would pressure him to confess or encourage someone close to him to come forward. However, nothing transpired. If anything, it probably just angered him. Another person who was upset about the whole situation was Chuck Covington. When Chuck saw the billboards, the thought that crossed his mind was that he hoped the killer would pass by one of them and take drastic action. While I can't condone such feelings, I understand that emotions run high in situations like these, especially for those who loved Egypt. For Chuck and others, the billboards were a sad reminder that she was gone. Curtis would drive by one and make a promise to Egypt each time, saying, "I've got you," as he vowed to find out who did this to her. Remember how Tina doesn't trust the Van Buren Township Police Department to do their job? She suggested they hire a private detective, someone with a lot of experience who could come in and look for things they might be missing. A friend named Debbie set up a fundraiser, and they ended up hiring a man named Dave. I won't go into all his credentials, but he's worked in law enforcement for over 20 years, with experience ranging from homicide to covert operations and undercover work. This guy is legit. I want to emphasize that Dave was retained to work for Egypt, not Tina. He was hired by a fundraiser from the community, and this distinction would become another huge divide in the family since Tina was essentially navigating this situation. On August 22, 2018, 14 months after the murder, the private investigator Dave and Tina set up a meeting with the Van Buren Township Police Department and their chief of police, Jason Wright. Wait until you hear the comments made by these law enforcement officials. The chief didn't hesitate to tell Tina that they had already taken the investigation as far as they could, and that no one besides the victim's family wanted to solve this case as much as they did. The only way to solve it, they said, was if someone came forward. That sounds like quite a cop-out, like saying they hope it'll just get solved on its own. They admitted to having their suspicions but couldn't connect anyone, stating they usually solve a murder in a week, but this case was different from day one. Tina wanted to know what they found on Egypt's phone. She asked if they ever got it unlocked, and I'm sitting here thinking, wait a minute, are you talking about Face ID? What kind of lock are we dealing with? Apparently, no one in her life knew how to unlock it because the police officers were completely locked out of her phone. What is this, the Stone Age? 14 months into the investigation, and they couldn't access her phone, not even with a gray box. Tina asked if they were aware of what a gray box was, and they didn't even know. This device was developed after a lawsuit regarding Apple locking iPhones, preventing even law enforcement from accessing them. A gray box allows the contents of an iPhone to be dumped without unlocking it. Chief Wright said he had never heard of a gray box. Well, if you only handle 2 homicides a year or so, you probably don't have access to that technology. Then Dave asked if they had done any process of life analysis, and Chief Wright didn't know what that was either. This process analyzes a victim's life and the impact of all the people and environments around them that could have contributed to their demise. The police claimed they were looking for patterns, but weren't sure which ones. All of this is very concerning, but now there's something even more alarming. They essentially told Tina that they weren't going to have the same relationship with her as they did with Chuck, Egypt's father. Why not? These are both family members of the victim, her mom and dad. They explained that it was because Chuck and Tina weren't on good terms and that she hadn't been thrilled with how the detectives were handling the case. Basically, they were saying they wouldn't work with her private detective because he was working for her. Isn't everyone working for Egypt? How childish is this? Started to make me think, is this what happens behind the scenes of murder cases? This back end that we don't see over niceties like, oh well, he's nicer to us than you are, and you don't like us, you don't think we're doing the job, so we're not going to even talk to your private investigator. Very odd. In this case, it's very odd. If the victim's parents don't care for the detectives, does this mean it changes the methods they use to solve the case or block others from helping? What's the issue? Well, the issue was that Tina didn't agree that Kenny was the killer. Everyone else pointed their fingers at him from day one. Egypt's father, the stepmom, the authorities, they were all on the same side, pushing that narrative. Is it not okay to question things and say, wait, let's not focus all of our attention on this one person? They can't even arrest him, still waiting over a year for one last piece of information. That's what they keep telling people. Why are they just sitting on their butts, waiting? So there's Tina. She's thinking anyone that goes against their narrative isn't going to get good treatment, even the mother of a victim. I don't know. Are cops always this way? Let me know if you know, because this is the very first case where I'm getting to see this type of information, and I have Lindsay to thank for all of this. I listened closely to everything she put together through her own research, and it was very valuable. And wait until you hear what happens next. After the meeting, the director of public safety, a guy named Greg Lorraine, says to Tina that there's a rumor going around that Egypt got around. Excuse me? Egypt got around? What the f? He can't be serious. This was a clear sign that they did not care about Egypt. Look at the way they painted her. You can use your imagination on what they were thinking in regard to her getting around. And I can't even begin to imagine how frustrating it would be to have no power over solving your own daughter's case when they have all the evidence and they won't provide it to you or your detective. It's like they're holding her daughter captive even after death. It's like a sick purgatory. These are the people that have been entrusted to solve Tina's daughter's murder. Lindsay says, F it, I'm gonna go ask Kenny some questions myself, because this girl's a badass. And I've never done this before, but Lindsay, if you're watching this, and I know a lot of family members watch my videos, if they see their loved one's name pop up, reach out to me. Honestly, I would love to have a conversation with you. I would love to collaborate on something with you, Lindsay, because none of the viewers know this yet, but Lindsay even started a podcast about true crime. I'm going to talk about that later, but let's get back to 2018. Lindsay and Dwayne decided to simply call Kenny up and ask him, did you do it? Did you kill Dwayne's sister? And Kenny answers, talks to both of them, and says, no, I didn't kill your sister. Of course, Lindsay asks, well, do you have proof of that? Do you have proof that you didn't kill her? And surprisingly, Kenny says yes, he does. He literally agrees to sit down with them to talk so that he could tell them his side of the story. Well, here's the thing. Even though Lindsay and Dwayne are fully capable of talking to Kenny and jotting down notes, it was actually pretty important that this interview was done correctly. Lindsay and Dwayne got their foot in the door with Kenny, but now was the time for someone professional to sit down and hear him out. That's what Dave did, and Kenny agreed. So, on June 14th, 2018, Kenny sat down with Dave and agreed to answer questions about Egypt. Kenny explained that the relationship was always pretty complicated from the beginning, but he said from the time they broke up, they were sleeping together on and off for at least the next 8 months. However, they were not together and not in a relationship. Their relationship was off by the time he heard that she was back with Curtis and moving in with him. That was a great segue into the Strawberry Festival and the fight that ensued. So Dave asked him about that too. He said he didn't show up with friends, he knew a lot of people in town, and he knew he'd probably run into people that he could just hang out with. Well, one of those people he says he ended up running into was actually Curtis, and that's not exactly the story that we heard. But Kenny said he overheard Curtis talking about Egypt moving in with him. He didn't remember who Curtis was talking to, but he heard it. Then, about 30 minutes later, Egypt comes up to them and wants to know, kind of like, what are you doing here? Why are you with Curtis? Why are you guys in the same vicinity? She wants nothing to do with it, and Kenny tries to say, hey, I want to talk to you about Curtis. She wasn't having it, so she walks away with Curtis. Kenny went over there and said, look, we're going to talk about this, so hang on. Because I personally see how this can look aggressive. He's coming towards the couple. He's obviously annoyed by what he heard. I don't know if Curtis or whoever said it wanted him to hear it because it was in earshot, but either way, it does seem like he wants to instigate something. I could be wrong. Nevertheless, he said that Egypt just laughed at him, and Dave said to Kenny, well, were you mad that she was moving in with Curtis? And he said, no, I wasn't mad. I was just surprised because she didn't tell me about that. So, Dave asked if they still talked, and Kenny said, yes, we are like family. He added that his sisters still went to movies with her, and he goes on to explain and admit that, yes, they exchanged some hot words, but it wasn't something that would ever lead to murder. And it didn't lead to murder, it was just like, Why the f didn't you tell me about it? But she wasn't having it, and she was just like, and left. Kenny even admits he did punch not one but two holes in a wall, but he repaired them both. Dave pressed Kenny about the timeline. Thursday, he said he was at the lake with his friends during the day, then he went out to the bars. He even said where he went. He went to Bayou Egan's, Lake View, one after the other. He stayed out till about 10 o'clock and then went home, ate some burritos, put on some Netflix or Hulu on his phone, and that's it. He also told Dave that he already told all of this to the Van Buren Township Police Department and asked them to please verify it to clear him. Kenny explained that he used his phone the whole time. It would show up, it would show his GPS, his whereabouts, what he was watching, when he was watching the shows, and he told the police, go check it. Get this, he even gave them his phone and his passcode, and then he told them that he had OnStar on his truck, and he wanted the Van Buren Township Police to check that out too, so they could confirm his alibi and focus on someone else. But Kenny explained that they had their sights set on making him the murderer, and that was that. As a matter of fact, the first night they interviewed him, they straight up looked at him and said, "You look guilty." He said, "Well, whatever, just tell me what you need to know because I am not guilty." But then he failed the polygraph. That's when they started to really put pressure on him. They were berating him, they were calling him a liar, and that's when they threatened to put him in jail for life. That is why he got an attorney. When Dave was done with the interview, he gave the tape over to Lindsay and Dwayne. This was exactly what Lindsay wanted, answers. Now that they heard Kenny's version in his own voice, which was pretty calm by the way, and he sounded that way through the whole thing, Lindsay and Dwayne began to change their minds, or at least they began to lean towards someone else being responsible besides Kenny. They thought it was a pretty good alibi because it can be verified. All police had to do was pull things like bank records, phone records, and video cameras at gas stations. There are gas stations lining roads to those bars, and if they had Kenny's phone, what did they find in it? Why wasn't more being done? What was the OnStar all about? Did that evidence ever get looked at? Lindsay and Dwayne were excited. They felt like they were getting somewhere. Now they needed to go even further. They felt like they wanted to share their findings with the rest of the family, Chuck's side, and some of Egypt's close friends, because they thought it was important to come together for Egypt with everything they knew. Plus, Lindsay wanted to hear what Chuck and Kristen had to say because Lindsay kept hearing, "If you only knew what Chuck and Chris knew about Kenny, then you'd see why he's guilty, no doubt. So show them." That was their train of thought. Good, you have proof, put it on the table. But when Lindsay sent out invitations, it was crickets. No one wanted to talk. Some of them declined right away with no real reasons, and Lindsay started to think, maybe it's me, maybe it's her. So you know what she said? "Let me stay back, let this be more of a family affair." So she told Dwayne, "Listen, let it be only your family," and people still declined. The only few that agreed were Chuck, Chris, and a close friend of Egypt's that was not named during my research. It's not important. What's important to note is that Lindsay knew this wasn't going to be an easy conversation. She had already been told how thick-headed and dead-set Chuck was on Kenny being the murderer, but she felt like she owed it to Egypt to try. And by the way, word had probably already gotten to Chuck because he was kind of buddy-buddy with the Van Buren Township Police Department, and they were not happy that Dave was conducting interviews and stepping on their toes. Really though, because isn't it in everyone's best interest to solve this case and have the right person behind bars? It's not a competition or a pissing contest, and it's someone's life. I was getting heated. All of this was getting me heated when I was reading it and listening to things. Chuck had been very vocal in public about Kenny. He had spoken to media outlets, he had been on shows, just making accusations and stating that the only one that had access to her apartment to carry out this crime was Kenny. And technically, that's incorrect. Ever being 100% accurate, Curtis did too, and so did her neighbors for that matter. But Curtis could do no wrong in their eyes. They loved Curtis. So it cuts both ways. They were okay with one of her boyfriends but not the other, and both had access to her. All that mattered were facts, and that is what Lindsay and Dwayne wanted to offer to Chuck. So finally, a dinner date was set with Egypt's dad, Chuck, stepmom Chris, and a close friend. Here's your text with added punctuation for clarity and coherence. They agreed to host a dinner at the Covington household. Lindsay brought a nice bottle of wine over, and she was welcomed inside their home. Before this night, they all got along pretty well. They had dinners together, and Lindsay brought her father out to a Detroit Tigers game with all of them to celebrate a beer that was created in Egypt's honor. We'll talk about that later because I think it's so super special, but all they wanted to do was sit down with everyone, eye to eye, and share info. It was like, convince me. Their intention wasn't to say they knew for sure that Kenny didn't kill her, but they didn't know for a fact that he did right away. Egypt's friend arrives, and she's, according to Lindsay, high, and she continues to smoke throughout the night, which made Lindsay feel like they weren't going to be taken seriously. Then another sore subject comes up, and it was Chuck who brought it up. Tina. Yes, and I don't know how deep this hatred or this feud goes between Tina and her ex, but it was a rule at the dinner table. Tina should not be discussed. So why are you bringing her up? The friend had actually publicly talked crap about Tina on Facebook. The only reason I'm mentioning this is because remember that this is Dwayne's mother. It's Egypt and Dwayne's mother that they're talking about. It's disrespectful. You can dislike someone, but that is still someone's mother. If you talked about my mother, my sisters, my daughter, anyone I love, it's gonna set me off. It was probably hard for Dwayne to hold his tongue. So before they could even get to the topic of Kenny, there was already tension surrounding Tina. Why? Because Chuck did not like that this guy Dave was sticking his nose into everyone's business. Why? Well, Chris pipes up and she says, I don't like Dave because he sends me inappropriate text messages. Well, that was news to Lindsay, and it was also quite concerning. Clearly, they don't want some man that they're working with to be inappropriate. So by the way, Lindsay asked to see the text or for information, and Chris was just like, I don't want to get into it right now. Well, to flash forward and come back, Lindsay does end up checking this out, and she goes through all of the text message exchanges between Chris and Dave, and there's nothing inappropriate. Yeah, so what's the story? Let's get back to what transpired this fall night in October of 2018. As Lindsay is still trying to understand the issue that they have with Dave, Chuck butts in and sternly tells Lindsay to basically shut up. He may have said it in a nicer way, he may have just, hushed her. But nonetheless, she was pretty embarrassed. He said that she was talking too much and it was his turn to talk, so she just shut up right then and there. Chuck gives his reasoning as to why they don't trust Dave, and wait until you hear this. Here's a name we haven't heard in a while, but I think it's a very important person in this case in many ways. Steve. Remember Steve? He's the neighbor, the guy that lives in the adjoining apartment on the other side of the duplex, the couple that sells weed and puppies. Well, Steve told Chuck, and by the way, why do they talk? What connection would they have? Why would Steve offer up information like this to Chuck? Or was he getting it through the good old boys at the Van Buren Township Police Department? We'll talk about why there are some ties that exist between Chuck and the township. But Steve told Chuck that Dave actually tried to break into his apartment. Lindsay's stunned. She's like, couldn't Steve be lying? And Lindsay went on to say they tried to reach out to Steve to speak to him, but he declined. If Steve didn't have anything to hide, why was it such an issue that a detective wanted to speak to him? And that's when the friend chimes in and says, well, he'll never talk to you. And Lindsay was shocked. She's sitting there thinking, what the heck? Are all of a sudden you guys all of Steve's personal secretaries? Because Kristen's also adding fuel to the fire, saying that Dave called Child Protective Services on Steve and Megan to get their child removed. Lindsay knew damn well that that was not true. Actually, he didn't, nor did Dwayne, nor did Tina or Lindsay. On the contrary, the Township PD already had issues with Steve's place. They were inside themselves, and it's true. Dave had been asked about what Stephen and Megan's place looked like. He did not break in, He had been over there. It was after that visit that Steve took issue with him. The township police actually called Dave and said, "What did you see inside?" They also asked Dwayne and Lindsay what they saw, but they had never been in the unit. So it was actually the township doing their own research into Steve, not Dave. We'll find out more about that unit later on, but at this point, dinner is not going well. No one is even eating. Lindsay doesn't understand why this is even a big deal. If you're a parent and you have nothing to hide, let them come. She's a mom. If someone is harming a child or living in conditions that aren't healthy, then they should be held accountable. If not, let the checks begin for the well-being of the children. Nothing Lindsay says seems to be getting through to anyone, except, of course, her other half, Dwayne, who knows Chuck very well. He spent many years growing up around this man and he keeps quiet, which is probably wise. Things did not get better, and they tell Lindsay why they don't like Tina, because she hangs out with a person of interest. Lindsay probably shouldn't have said anything, but she chimed in, "Well, you do too with Curtis." This set Chuck off, and it was already going to happen. I feel like no matter what was said, it would happen. He set his phone timer for 30 seconds and told Lindsay she could talk for that long. That's it. Well, Lindsay does not let men speak to her that way. Nope. She was there putting all this effort into helping solve his daughter's murder. She did not feel respected, and she showed it. She caused a little bit of a scene, ending with her saying something to the effect of, "You know what? You never even knew Egypt. You never even met her, and you're gonna come in here and challenge her family." It wasn't okay. Well, she leaves, gets into her car, and has a little cry. She definitely felt defeated. If it were me, I'm really sensitive, I would have been bawling my eyes out. I don't think I'm anywhere near as strong as Lindsay. Even though she was upset, she understood it. She was the new girl dating Egypt's brother. Who was she to say anything to tell them that Egypt's family was wrong? So she decides it's time for her to back off, to stop doing this. She realized it probably wasn't her place to do so, but Dwayne wasn't going to let that happen. He just kept saying, "Please don't stop. Don't allow this to stop our fight for my sister." That's what he said. But she did not want to tear this family apart even more. She felt at this point she was probably doing more harm than good. However, she would hear Dwayne out, and after they had several discussions about everything, Lindsay decided that she was going to continue. For Dwayne, for Egypt. And I'm going to say I am so thankful that she did. Next on her list was meeting with the detectives from the Van Buren Township Police Department herself. Spoiler alert, that did not go so well either. It was November 19, 2018 to 515 days since Egypt had been murdered, and Lindsay and Dwayne asked the Township Police Department for an update. They wanted a sit-down, an explanation, and to know the progress of the case. They had never sat down with Dwayne before. They still hadn't even reached out to him for an interview. You'd think, considering he's the brother of the woman you're trying to fight for, that they would have compassion. No, they were not warmly welcomed. The detectives did not show them empathy. And this was recorded. Yes, it was recorded. I don't know if this was recorded by Lindsay because at the time, Michigan was what's referred to as a one-party consent state. This means that it's not illegal to record a private conversation if the person recording is a party to that conversation, even without the consent of the other party. But it might have been gathered through the Freedom of Information Act. I'm not sure. All they wanted was an update. That should have been so easy. It's not that much to ask for. I listened to this whole recording and damn, were these men defensive. It was bad. There were 4 men, Director Lorraine, Lieutenant Bass, Detective McCarthy, and the Chief of Police, Jason Wright. The funny thing is they wanted information from Lindsay. That's the first thing they asked. They're like, so, any new tips? What you got for me? Isn't that their job? After Lindsay tried to get over the fact that these men didn't even give their condolences or say they were sorry for their loss, they just acted like this was just another number on their list to check off. She explained that they were there because they wanted information on the suspects. They wanted evidence and progress in the case. And their answer was, "We're at where we're at." That's what they said. We're at where we're at. Seriously? This was blowing Lindsay's mind. She teaches kindergartners, and I'm sure they would have more to say than these supposedly professional officers. I can't tell you every single thing that was said. I will link the interview below, and I encourage you to go check it out after all this, but I will highlight some of the most important points. It seemed like they thought it could only be two people, Curtis or Kenny. That's it. It was either one or the other, but Kenny was the one they labeled as the person of interest. So when she pressed them, and she's a badass about why they think Kenny did it, they actually said it was because he didn't give them good answers. He's got a lawyer, and he stopped talking to them, and everybody else gave good answers that made sense and cooperated. That's what you call some expert detective work right there. Another issue the men had was with the bar crowd, as they referred to it. They said that the bar crowd was making it hard on them, that the bar crowd was ridiculous. Lindsay wasn't following. She was like, "What do you mean, the bar crowd?" What they meant was, basically, they didn't like Egypt's friends, who she hung around with, and what they did for a living, because it made it harder for them to do their job. They explained there was this close-knit town where everybody knows everyone, and they would talk, they would go wishy-washy, and then there were tips that would turn out to be nonsense. That's an investigation, that's what you have to do. They even said that Kenny's family came forward with tips, and it made them go on a wild goose chase. Well, okay, maybe they're just trying to bring up tips that would help, just like everyone else. When Lindsay asked about the neighbors and their whereabouts, she got a really weird answer. The neighbors were allegedly out of town at a music festival. Remember this? But then she says to the detectives, "Wait, did you check their phones, their GPS? Can I see that information?" And they were like, "Well, no, we didn't need to do that." She's stunned. She's like, "You're taking their word for it? What kind of investigation is this?" It seemed really messed up, like the whole investigation had been botched. All this time had gone by, and it seemed like a big waste of time and taxpayers' money. The answers from the detectives were not to worry about the neighbors because they were just low-level potheads selling weed and ugly dogs that all over their place to make a buck here and there. By the way, they even said there was no furniture in the unit, only weed and dog. So does that sound like a good place for a child to live? I'm not trying to be judgmental. I'm telling you, according to everything you've heard, maybe that's why CPS was called. Maybe it wasn't Dave, but remember, Chuck and Chris were sticking up for Steve. There were other weird parts of the interview where they were saying things like, "You know, Egypt was the type that would fight back if she were attacked." I didn't understand what that had to do with anything, and Lindsay chimed in, arguing that she did not feel comfortable with them pegging Egypt a certain way, as doing one thing or another. We don't know who she was faced with or what, so we can't assume anything. It doesn't matter how tough she might have been. If you're put in a certain situation, even the strongest person could cower. During this interview, Lindsay asked if the case could be turned over to the Michigan State Police, and you could immediately tell that it rubbed them the wrong way. Totally. Of course, it did. The detectives argued that it was their case and that the Michigan State Police didn't have any more resources than they did. Really? Then they went on to brag about 8 FBI profilers that had worked on Egypt's case, and all of them pointed to Kenny. When Lindsay wanted the names of the profilers, they wouldn't provide them. Again, no proof. One officer said Curtis may have been an entup to Egypt in the past, but that was many, many years ago, and they were giving their relationship another shot. He went through messages, and they were in love. They were moving in together. So why would he kill his girlfriend? Oh, I don't know. But why wouldn't he? It was just a back and forth again and again. She kept pressing him about why the Michigan State Police were not involved. It seemed like a cockfight. It just seemed like the township did not want to give up their case. They said that they couldn't do a better job. Lindsay asked, "Well, don't you think that they have more experience since they deal with more murders? It would make sense." She had done her research, and just one of the officers in the homicide department had worked on 10 murders. One worked on 10 murders in 1 year. Yet these men were trying to convince them that Egypt's case was better in the township police department's hands. Lindsay called BS. During this interview, they also learned about how close Chuck was to this department. He owns a company that provides public transportation throughout different states across the US, a pretty big business. Chuck was into public safety, so he actually went on ride-alongs with the Van Buren Township Police Department. He knew the officers, and he thought they were great guys. So was Chuck worried about losing some kind of business contract with the city or Michigan as a whole? Maybe he didn't want to ruffle any feathers, but that couldn't be it, because that was his daughter. He could have just really been bros with these guys and trusted that they were absolutely doing the best they possibly could. But that was not good enough for Dwayne and Lindsay. There were times I was cringing as these guys were talking about how great their polygraph technology was. It's a pseudoscience. It's not even admissible in court. It's a waste of time. But they were arguing that their polygraph guy was never wrong. After this interview, which seemed to go nowhere except maybe getting Lindsay a job offer, that's right. The director turned to Dwayne and said, "Oh, she's good," and said she was wasting her time being a teacher and should join the police academy. Wow, that's right. Okay, wow. After leaving this interview, they thought they would never get a break in this case, but something wild was about to happen. Lindsay and Dwayne's goal at this point was just to get the case out of the hands of the Van Buren Township Police Department and into the hands of the Michigan State Police. And by the way, just to bring some light into this entire situation, all the while, Lindsay and Dwayne were growing closer and closer, and their relationship was getting stronger and stronger, as you can imagine. And finally, Dwayne proposed to Lindsay, and the ring, that was a ring that Egypt had always wanted when she got engaged. Without knowing it, Tina had given the ring to Dwayne to give to Lindsay, and it is a very, very special ring. I think it is exactly where it belongs, on Lindsay's finger. She now carries around a piece of Egypt wherever she goes, and it is such an honor and a reminder of a beautiful woman who was lost too soon. At this time, there was still no arrest for Egypt's murder. Lindsay and Dwayne were 100% convinced that the Van Buren Township Police Department was wasting their time with Kenny, and they were going to do their best to prove it. They were not going to stop. They couldn't stop. They wouldn't stop. And that's actually the name of their podcast. Can't Stop, Won't Stop. They started to raise more and more awareness for her case, and at that point, they were convinced they had to go to someone higher up because after the doozy of an interview they had with the chief, the director, and the detectives, they figured they were going to get nowhere. It was coming up on the 2nd anniversary of Egypt's death, so the first thing they wanted to do was reach out to a local newspaper and have an article written about Egypt's story. The Belleville Area Independent was the publication that talked about everything going on in Van Buren Township. It was March 25th, 2019, and wait until you hear about the drama and the unfortunate circumstances that were playing out when they tried to get Egypt's story written about. Lindsay sent an email to the township supervisor, Kevin McNamara, and the public safety director, Greg Lorraine. She explained that she had called to get the article published and had spoken to a woman named Rosemary over the phone. Lindsay got some weird pushback because Rosemary was like, "Well, you know what? Chuck is for the police and Tina's against the police." Lindsay wasn't sure what that had to do with an article about Egypt, and she said that's not even true. Rosemary responded, "Well, that's what the police told me." When Lindsay snapped back and said she wanted that in writing, Rosemary hung up on her, saying she wanted nothing to do with the case. The call lasted 2 minutes. Of course, Lindsay was upset, so she wrote this email about the treatment she was getting and experiencing from the township and that it wasn't acceptable. Lindsay never got a response, but she was told that Rosemary had been instructed by the police not to speak to them. On July 23, Dwayne reached out to who he thought was the lead detective on the case, and guess what? It turns out he was no longer working on the case. No one had even notified Egypt's family that there was someone else on Egypt's case. They didn't have the common courtesy to let them know. Dwayne was trying to look at this as a positive thing. Maybe new eyes, fresh eyes would be looking through everything. But that couldn't be further from the truth. William Bettendorf was the new lead on the case, and there's a 20-minute phone conversation between Lindsay and him. I'm gonna tell you, I listened to the whole thing, and I'm so glad I did, but I'm not gonna make you do that. I think it was worth the 20 minutes, but I'm gonna paraphrase what was said and highlight the most important, damning, or downright disgusting things or confusing things for all of you. The first thing I noticed was he was out of breath. He was just talking about how this case is so hard for him. I understand that it is hard, but as statistics are concerned, they have 2 homicides per year in this township. What could be more important than Egypt's murder? He was making excuses for why he hadn't gotten to things yet, like, oh, I'm so busy, there's so much that has gone on, and so much time has passed. But I digress. He does say that there are only 3 people working on the entire case. 3, and it's still in the best hands. So, Lindsay says, you know what, you just said it was a lot of work. Don't you think that someone more experienced should help? He blatantly says, oh yeah, the Michigan State Police, they don't want this case. Lindsay was taken aback. She was like, wow, they're not interested in Egypt's case? In the next couple of minutes, they talked about the polygraph again, going back and forth about whether it was inconclusive or whether he failed miserably. It's just, again, who cares? It's pointless. It can't even be used. Then he goes on to mention the FBI, just like the other officers had mentioned before, talking about how the FBI agents say that there's only one person that has a clear motive to do this. And what was that motive? The recent breakup and the new boyfriend. But it also kind of seems like they don't even have information. They keep saying the same thing and going in circles about why Kenny is the one they want to focus on. Lindsay makes a good point. Okay guys, you've had this information for over 2 years. What's going on? What's stopping you from arresting him? Then she asked one more time, can't the state police just take the case? That's when he blatantly says, oh, they've looked at it and they didn't have any interest in it at all. It really made me sad. It was just the way that he said it. Like, they have no reason to want this case. It's not just a case, it's a person. I just can't imagine listening to that, being at my daughter's or my mother's or my sister's funeral. It's a person hearing that somebody doesn't care. It's just insensitive and heartless. I understand there are people who lose their lives every day, and I know that a lot of resources go into it, and maybe they don't think anyone is special. But when you lose someone, they are special. And seriously, literally, at the end of this conversation, you know what he says? We just have to take the wait-and-see approach. Sounds like he doesn't plan to do anything with the case. What does that mean for the family? They're just gonna sit there and wait? There was another interesting thing in the interview. She asked them, because she heard this, why Steve had told her, the Van Buren Township Police Department don't with me. It seems like they kind of cover for Steve or, let things get swept under the rug for him. So she asked why it turned out, and I didn't want to go into this, but Steve had tried to get Dave, the private investigator, put in jail. He had tried to bring charges against him and went all the way to court. It was embarrassing, and none of those charges ever stuck. But why was something drug-related going on? They didn't know. Lindsay just wants to know. It could be anyone related to this case. Why are we just not looking into certain people? She starts to give them theories. She says, well, there were a lot of people going in and out. How do we know that one of those people picking up drugs didn't see Egypt and get infatuated with her, then come back when they knew the neighbors were going out of town? How do we know that maybe they knew her schedule? Maybe they went there to do her harm or to take advantage of her. We don't know who this Steve guy is, and why would he make a statement that the police don't with him, and why try to protect a man like that? It just seems like something doesn't add up. So they made a Facebook page called Justice for Egypt, The Truth Behind the Investigation. It was August 2019, 26 months after Egypt's murder, and their mission for this group was for the community to come together and find justice. Any tips, anything like that? This came in handy because something crazy was about to happen. I find this to be very interesting. All they wanted to do was get the case out of the township's hands and into the state police's hands. As soon as Lindsay starts to share things in the Facebook group, you know how it spreads like wildfire. Everyone wants to know. Now the community is taking notice. They're starting to become concerned because she's sharing everything that you just heard. They were starting to think about things in a different light. They were upset. They didn't think they were being protected by their police department. So on September 9, 2019, all of their hard work paid off because they got an interview with a detective first lieutenant from the Michigan State Police. I'm not going to go into this whole interview, but the most important thing for you to take away from this is that he says he had talked to the township police department a number of times and literally asked them if they needed help, and they said no. They declined. Not once, not twice, not 3 times, but a number of times. They offered him 12 men to come in and work on Egypt's case. So it was a lie. Would you want liars working on your case? Because that 20-minute conversation Lindsay got under the Freedom of Information Act, and she gave it to this first lieutenant from the Michigan State Police. After this meeting, they wanted to get a petition signed. They wanted people to come forward and ask the Van Buren Township Police to hand over Egypt's case to the Michigan State Police. They got 14,000 people to sign this petition, believe it or not. Egypt's own family, one of her sisters, her stepmom, and some of her friends, did not like this. They pushed back, making public Facebook posts asking people not to sign the petition, in all caps with like 10 exclamation points. Do not sign this. You're gonna do more damage than good. You don't realize what you're doing. It's based on lies. This was such a back and forth all the time. There were even threats like, if you sign this and something happens, it's gonna be your fault, to that effect. You know what I'm saying? The family was divided, like I said, the great divide. I'm just gonna be straight up. If it wasn't for Lindsay and Dwayne, I don't think this case would have gotten as far as it did. Wait till you hear what happens next and where everything stands regarding who did this to Egypt. Some of Egypt's family members even accused Lindsay of doing this for attention. Can you imagine that? The attention they were trying to get was on Egypt. She was reaching out to everyone, podcasters, probably YouTubers, who knows? She was going to all media outlets, and they didn't even want to talk to her at first. Lindsay doesn't win a prize. Nobody wins anything. We can never bring Egypt back, but we can bring the person that did this to justice. That's what we can do, and that's what Lindsay wanted to do. So call it luck or something else, but there's finally a break in the case. It's persistence. Maybe, like Lindsay said, can't stop, won't stop. She started to CC that head lieutenant of the state police on every email that she would send to the Van Buren Police Department. She would CC the state police every time, again and again and again. She was doing this because she wanted to be annoying. She wanted to be the persistent person that they just wanted to get rid of. To say, hand the case to the Michigan State Police. We're tired of it. They were doing everything they could. They showed up at the town council meetings on Zoom because now at this point we're going into 2020 and it's COVID-19, that whole thing. But they were persistent. Anytime there was any kind of meeting in town over Zoom, they were there. You couldn't get rid of Lindsay and Dwayne, and they would ask questions every time regarding Egypt's case. Months and months went by. Every single chance they got, they just kept pushing and pestering the local authorities, again and again, criticizing the local police, and trying to get the investigation moved. They never got responses, never. Nobody seemed to care. They just wanted to ignore them and hope they would go away. But then one day something happened. Dwayne says to Lindsay, "Oh my God, did you see the email that we just got back from the town clerk?" And she's like, "No, what do you mean?" He replies, "Guess what? They accidentally responded thinking they were only responding to the local officials, but not to Dwayne, and somehow Dwayne was still left on the response." Can you believe that? Okay, so the town clerk had meant to remove the family members from his response before hitting send, but he forgot. And you know what he said? Is there any way these emails to everyone can be blocked? I'm personally not interested in the stupidness. The stupidness? These were emails about Egypt, a woman that was murdered in their town. I think we can all agree it's not stupidness. And of course, you know what Lindsay did. She took that email and put it everywhere, on Facebook pages, on the township pages. She gave it to the state police. That's right, here was the county clerk. This is what they think of an unsolved murder of an innocent woman named Egypt Covington. This created a forked storm. Even though the clerk apologized, saying, "Oh, I didn't mean any disrespect to Egypt. I really just didn't want to be on a chain of emails. It doesn't matter." There was a public protest, a march that was held by Lindsay and Dwayne. And just one day afterward, guess who reaches out? It actually kind of brings tears to my eyes, the Michigan State Police. It was the lead detective on the case, and when he reached out to Lindsay and Dwayne, she was like, "Does this mean that you have our case?" He said yes. They were so excited, they couldn't help but cry. These were tears of joy. This is exactly what they wanted, and it was so emotional. It was November of 2020, and it had been more than 3 years that had gone by. Finally, it was in the hands of the Michigan State Police. They figured they waited this long, they were probably going to have to wait a long time before anything new happened in this case. But just a little over 3 months later, they got some very big but very unexpected information. They were informed that an arrest had been made. This was huge. Everyone getting the news about this arrest had their heads spinning. Who was it? Was it Kenny? Nobody knew. Lindsay wanted to find out whether it was Kenny, so she called him. When he answered the phone, she realized, Kenny's not in jail, so it's not Kenny. So who was arrested? There was no other information, they just had to wait. It turns out the Michigan State Police gave names of the suspects, 3 of them. This added so much more confusion because when they gave the names of these men who had been arrested, no one knew who they were. These names came out in the final weeks of 2021. Shane Evans, Timothy Moore, and Shandon Groom. They were arrested and charged in the murder of Egypt Covington. The names meant nothing to Egypt's friends and family. This was a small town where everyone knew each other. So who were these men? It was confusing. In March of this year, 2022, all 3 of them appeared on a Zoom call for a preliminary hearing. The biggest question everyone wanted to know was how and what happened. Why would these men want to hurt her? The prosecution laid out their case in this pretrial hearing, and an entirely new story started to emerge, one that I still cannot wrap my brain around. This is an ongoing case. Dare I say it's an unsolved murder because these men have not gone to trial, and all 3 of them are related. Shane and Timothy are brothers, and Shandon is their cousin. Well, guess what? One of them knew Egypt, Shane Evans. They had gone to high school together. But there was something else. Remember Steve and Megan? Well, Steve had actually hired Shane to cut the lawn. What lawn? The lawn in front of the duplex. Who lives in the duplex? Steve, Megan, their child, and Egypt Covington. Shane saw Egypt all the time because he was there to cut the grass. How did all of this connect? Well, police said that they ran video surveillance tapes and saw a Dodge Ram entering a nearby parking lot. They connected this truck to these men. That truck was seen at a gas station right in Egypt's duplex vicinity on the night she was killed. They wanted to know what happened, so they brought Shane Evans in. The story that he told seems unreal, unbelievable, especially to me. This is what I don't understand. And you'll have to piece this together yourself and leave it in the comments because I am still so confused. Shane said that his brother and his cousin, who live all the way in Toledo, were in town that night and wanted some weed. They just wanted to have a little smoke out. Shane says, "Well, I know someone who sells it, but unfortunately he's out of town this weekend for a music festival, so I guess you're just gonna have to wait." Well, here's the thing. When has it ever been hard to get weed? I don't know. You tell me. This was Chuck's argument, and I have to agree. He said it's not hard to get weed in Michigan. But Shane is adamant that his brother and his cousin said, "You know what? We'll just go to Steve's house and get it ourselves. We'll let ourselves in and take what we want and leave." So according to Shane, he had them follow him in their truck. Shane was in front, driving past Egypt's duplex, while they were driving behind. He uses his hand, points out the window, and points to the duplex, saying, It's the unit on the right. That's where he directed them to go. According to his story, instead of going into the unit on the right, they end up going into the unit on the left, Egypt Covington's unit. These two men came in, men she had never met in her entire life. According to prosecutors, while Egypt was watching a movie, they bound her with Christmas lights and shot her once through a couch cushion into the head, killing her. Why? If you were going to steal weed from a neighbor, why would you end up killing an innocent woman? Shane later tells police that his brother sent him a text saying, "Oops, wrong door." That's all the text said, heartless and inhumane, just, "Oops, wrong door." Do you believe that all it took was them going into the wrong unit for Egypt to lose her life? That nothing else was going on, that there are no other connections, even though Shane knew her? Of course, they have a defense and are already trying to say that the videos were bad, that you can't really read the license plate, and that you can't prove they were there. But there's enough evidence for them to go to trial, and the best piece of evidence was their cell phones. Apparently their cell phones were at Egypt's place for a matter of minutes, and then Egypt's phone and their phones went in the same direction until Egypt's phone was discarded. So they were definitely there. A lot has been done by people like Lindsay and of course Egypt's family to keep her memory alive. There was actually a beer created called A Girl Named Egypt, and I wanted to showcase that on screen. Chuck also set up a fund in Egypt's name to help kids learn how to play musical instruments. Not only that, a monument was set up in Belleville, and the inscription comes right from Egypt's journal. All of this information I've shared is everything I've heard and tried to piece together, and here are some of my own thoughts. I am not a detective, this is not a court of law, this is a YouTube video. I do this so that we can remember someone who was taken from this earth, Egypt Covington. I feel so bad for her entire family. I know there's been a lot of drama in this case, and there are many different perspectives. I mean no harm to anyone. I'm just here to gather information, and I'm getting all this from what's readily available online. I will say that Lindsay has decided to pause her podcast for now, out of respect for the family and the sensitive information that could be detrimental to this case in some way. She plans to restart it when the trial has concluded, and I totally understand that. I'm going to give you all of those links in my description box. Now, I wanted to give a reason that this could possibly have been a random crime. It's going to be quick, but you have to understand that criminals don't think like we do. My father is a criminal. I've grown up listening to his stories. When someone is already in that mindset, we don't know if they were on drugs. There's nothing to go on right now. But if they were on other substances, you're not in your right mind. Regardless, if you have a criminal mind, that's why they call it a criminal mind. If you're hyped up and you go in and you've already got charges on you because just so you know, they do have criminal records. One of them, I think the main person being charged who had the gun and committed the crime, already had a criminal record and could be put away for a long time. You would think the reasonable thing to do is not to commit an even greater crime. But in that moment, in that split second when you think no one's there, when you think no one will care, when you're a criminal and you're thinking more about yourself, in that split second, you make these kinds of decisions. It could have been all about marijuana. It seems horrific to think and unbelievable to assume that this could have just been a wrong door. When we talked about the Christmas lights, the only thing that comes to my mind is that she was moving. If there were boxes set up and things were in those boxes with one labeled Christmas and Christmas lights were readily accessible, it would make sense. When you're trying to hold someone down who might be screaming or fighting, you tell your buddy, "Hey, grab something right now." If cords are all around you, it's a terrible thought, but they might have been readily available in that moment to stop her.